After 35 long years of giving his blood, sweat, and tears, the final moment felt hollow. Everything he made, a needle so fine it could pierce without pain, gears smaller than a grain of rice, and craftsmanship more delicate than a sliver of a banknote, came from world-class Japanese precision. A legacy crafted by artisans, people admire him. At Fujimura Manufacturing, a man in a suit confronted the elderly craftsman. Takuma Fujimura, now 70, faced him with steely defiance. The deal was impossible, the pay insultingly low, and the deadline absurdly short. Fujimura rejected it outright. The visitor stayed unfazed and ignored his protest. There were others, after all, easier, cheaper, and more obedient. From the start, he saw Fujimura and his kind as outdated and inconvenient. To him, old-school skills had no place in today's market. The goal wasn't mastery, the goal was efficiency. The notion that men like Fujimura should be grateful just to be considered pushed him over the edge, and he snapped, grabbing the man by the collar. A lifetime spent honing his craft made him take pride in every piece, and he would never make work he could not stand behind, not even for a paycheck. He often told the man he was full. The visitor retreated and vowed to seek revenge through corporate channels. He warned the altercation would not go unpunished, but the damage was already done. Fujimura's future prospects had nearly vanished. Standing alone, Fujimura stared at the clock. He felt lost. No one would hire a 70-year-old man with no connections, no family, or any support, and he shook his weathered hands. Hands that had known only one world of machines, precision, metal, and discipline, now faced the unknown. Still, he figured he'd manage somehow, as he always had, and stepped outside. He stood facing the building he had poured his soul into, Fujimura Manufacturing. That name held a lifetime of memories, including mistakes, lessons, and triumphs. He had progressed from apprentice to master, and then to independent craftsman. Having seen the best and the worst, he could at least call his life a job well done. Only one regret remained. He had wanted, just once and with his own hands, to test his skills on the world stage and see how far his craftsmanship could reach, so he reached up to take down the wooden signboard, but as he strained, his body gave out. A sharp pain shot through his chest, and he collapsed. He realized too late how little attention he'd paid to his body. As his breath escaped him, his vision faded. All he could think was that he needed more time. Everything changed. Face down on a surface that wasn't concrete, he smelled grass, heard wind whisper through the trees, and listened to unfamiliar sounds from a sky he did not recognize. The world around him had shifted. He had no idea where he was, and it was not Japan or the world he knew. He lifted his head. Fujimura is a satyprite. Without realizing it, he had somehow become younger. He looked toward the castle. He watched it without getting involved. A translucent screen appeared before him, my Kaugan, and I serve the master craftsman. He turned and saw what looked like his workshop, looked down at his arms and noticed his clothes were oversized, the jacket sleeves flopping, and he felt unsure, as if it was not about him. Nothing made sense. He was sure he'd collapsed back in the lot, and now he found himself swimming in clothes far too large for his small frame. Pushing his sleeves to his elbows, he heard a sharp clank of metal, turned toward the sound, and saw a figure striking a wooden log with a sword. A woman stood there, Frau von Freya, a healer, breathing heavily and clearly fatigued. She swung at the log again. This time her prosthetic arm came loose and she hit the ground with a dull thought. Clenching her jaw, she stared at the fallen limb. Fujimura took in the scene and reached for her prosthetic hand. He came closer and called out, asking where they were. She flinched. He said he was lost and asked her to be patient and hear him out. She blinked, puzzled by his wording. Old Coot couldn't quite make sense of the reaction. Later they entered what he assumed was his workshop. He thought to himself that this had to be a dream. It was strange that the dream took him back to being a bratty kid in Europe, since he'd never set foot outside Japan, even though the castle looked European. Freya broke his train of thought to check on him and asked if he was all right. He had seemed down earlier, but he brushed it off and returned his focus to the device in front of him. After tightening a screw, he handed it to her and asked her to try it on, adding that he'd just thrown it together, and Freya's eyes widened when she slipped the hand into place. The new prosthetic clattered against her arm, deepening her astonishment. Amazed, she felt the balance and fluidity were completely natural, light yet stable and fully in motion, and she couldn't believe he made it so quickly. She likened him to the dwarves of legend. They were mythical craftsmen famed for their smithing, and when he asked for more, she said these dwarves were regarded as apostles of the gods who forged legendary weapons for heroes. Freya continued, her voice full of admiration, and described magical weapons forged to seal the Demon King, including a sword that summoned destructive lightning, a staff that could raise the dead, and a shield that warded off calamity. Even with all the legendary weapons in the world, Freya said they made little difference. The Demon King's army had revived and was moving again. She dreamed of becoming a great hero who wielded such weapons. The reality was harsher. She was just a powerless healer who had recently been kicked out of her party and now wandered alone as a solo adventurer, forcing herself to learn swordsmanship bit by bit with only one arm. Even that was an uphill battle, but she laughed about it. Fujimura listened and began to wonder what this person was talking about. Then it hit him that he must have stumbled into someone's bizarre, ridiculous dream, some fantasy nonsense, and on TV dreams usually end with some kind of impact. A slap hit his face hard enough to bruise his cheek and make his nose bleed. Pain surged through him as he held his face, wincing. Freya rushed over, concerned. Using her healing magic, a soft light formed around his wound and the bruises slowly faded. She sighed in relief. He was healed. Healing magic was the one thing she could really be proud of. Even then, part of the credit went to her staff, a treasured family heirloom that held a rare Class B magic stone, a lantern crystal scarce even in this country. He turned his back. She called his name, Mr. Fujimura. His eyes widened as he reached for a cigarette, lit it, and immediately began coughing, his eyes widening again. The feeling was no longer vague. Freya kept calling after him as he stumbled forward, asking where he was going. He looked up. She called him once more. Then it hit him, this wasn't just a dream. He had somehow ended up in a completely different world. Demon Kings, heroes, enchanted relics, it was all real here. A 70-year-old man suddenly found himself in a full-blown fantasy adventure. In fact, he was no longer 70 and was a kid now. It was a complete reset. Finding a way to make a living here seemed impossible. Then an idea hit him. Arms. If powerful weapons mattered more than numbers, he would have to make better ones of his own. He turned back to Freya and reached out his hand. He asked to borrow her staff, and she looked shocked. He said it would only be for 2 or 3 months, but she shook her head because she couldn't give it up since it was her family's treasure, and she apologized sincerely. The answer left him stunned. Seeing him close to tears, she hurried to soften the blow. His expression stirred something in her. If he kept looking like that, she felt she might actually give in. Later, Fujimura thanked him, said it was to be expected from someone who wants to be a hero, and promised this old man would take good care of the staff. Freya hesitated, then clarified she was only lending it and asked if he wanted anything else. Fujimura paused, agreed it was a good point, and suggested they return to the workshop to grab something to eat, and if she had a book about this world, asked if he could borrow it too. She nodded in agreement. Fujimura considered his situation. At least he could understand the language and even read the writing. Freya said she would return to town for a while, and he acknowledged her by calling her a young lass. She corrected him, saying her name was Frau. Before she left, she warned everyone not to go near the northern mountains, especially at night. Strange sightings there had been called the Islas. Fujimura asked what that was, clearly curious. Freya said it was a night demon responsible for destroying many villages in the past, a bat-like creature with a triple B subjugation rank. Although the kingdom's knights had supposedly taken it down years ago, more and more people have been seeing it again. Fujimura answered dismissively, which irritated her. Freya reminded him this was not a small matter. They were talking about a triple B threat. He told her to shut it, saying he already had too much on his plate. Freya apologized softly. This was the fantasy realm called Elvana. In this land, minerals had a unique and powerful role, and the most valuable resources were magic stones. Crystals that produced electricity, heat, or light when mana was channeled into them acted like natural batteries, forming the foundation of the world's magic and powering everything from daily life to warfare. Fujimura decided to tinker with him. In his hand lay a peculiar mineral. Its texture and behavior made no logical sense to him. Still, a mineral was a mineral. He would figure it out. He held the chisek again, the analytical eye. It gleamed in his palm as he focused on it. The jam started to glow, lighting the nearby stones, then it caught fire. Startled, he stared at it. It was on a whole different level from the others. Thinking it might be a glowing stone, he began sawing into it. When he cut into it, small shavings fell onto the table. Immediately, lightning crackled. The particles began to float, and a blinding flash erupted. They made a significant discovery when they found a high-purity crystal core inside the stone. It made up only 20% of the stone's internal volume. The rest acted as limiters and suppressed its magical output. In short, the world's magic was diluted. What people called magic was only a fraction, a tenth of the original energy. The stone's true power was sealed away. Its shavings would explode from only a tiny trace of magic, and the material itself was gummy and unstable, reminding him of real-world metals like titanium or inconel, both notoriously hard to cut because they are tough and conduct heat poorly. Fujimura welcomed the challenge. Working with metal was a complex art. It began with preparing materials and tools, then cutting, shaping, and finally drilling and threading. Mastering these steps required more than following instructions and called for an artisan's intuition, choosing the right tool, applying the right amount of force, and making judgments on the fly. Exceptional craftsmen had to detect the smallest changes in sound, resistance, or heat, notice the subtle warping of metal and its reshaping under strain, and feel the warmth rising on the skin, registering it all instinctively. They make immediate adjustments instinctively. This process makes their work far more precise and of higher quality than machines can match. Fujimura exhaled as an explosion sounded nearby, but did not flinch, and he kept working while smoking several cigarettes. By the following morning, the job was completed. Staring at it, he thought 3 whole days had passed. It had been a long time since he put his body through something like this. He looked at his hand, and something was off. This wasn't the body he remembered. There was no exhaustion in the muscles. Instead, his mind bore the burden, his head foggy with fatigue, and strange visual cues appeared in his vision, flickering like phantom text, ranking in Eye of the Alchemist, Super Recovery, Super Focus, Shinteikuka Body Reinforcement, Heat Resistance, Godlike Reflexes, Eye of Prediction, Skill Addition, Manoregulation. He had poison resistance, and feeling disoriented, he went outside for fresh air and stretched, his thoughts turning to Freya, the girl who called herself a powerless healer who had been fired from her party and was now fending for herself as a solo adventurer. Having only one arm and a prosthetic, she would be at a steep disadvantage no matter how much she trained. Starting from a non-combat role only made things tougher. He was on his own too, so he shouldn't be so critical. A faint glimmer nearby drew his attention, a stone embedded in the ground. Curiosity led him to pick it up. From that point, the discovery, extraction, and crafting of core stones would become the foundation of Elvana's new technological era. He had just taken the first step. Later that day, Fru arrived at his workshop, greeted him, and reminded him that the deadline to return her staff was today. No answer made her assume he was out, but then she saw him collapsed on the floor and snoring, so she called his name and he woke up groggily. Acknowledging her presence, he asked her to wait while he made some coffee, then thanked her, saying the staff had been really handy, and she paused making the coffee as he settled onto the couch. A strange, unfamiliar object sat on the table near Satish. Pointing at it, she asked what the suspicious cylindrical thing was, and he replied casually that it was a gun and chuckled that he'd always wanted to make one since he was a kid, laws be damned. Then her attention turned serious, and she wanted to know where her staff was, and Fujimura pointed across the room and said it was right there. He asked her if it looked more stylish now. Before Fujimura lay a weapon built for performance, streamlined, efficient, and destructive, a fusion of design and lethality, and the world's first magic gun forged from a barrel and bullets made with his proprietary corn metal, with the barrel itself his work. He leaned back, quietly awed by his own genius while Frau panicked, screamed, and begged him to change it back, but Fujimura shook his head because the staff was practically fused with the iron. He pointed to something nearby. She looked and fell silent. He pulled away. A fabric covering, and uncovered a hoard of shining stones, the ground around them faintly glowing, and explained it was amazing because he could mine as many magic stones as he wanted from the area. She froze and stared. Each one was genuine. Completely overwhelmed, she had no idea how he had found this place. Fujimura examined the rocks. When asked how, he said he had simply taken a good look and could see something glowing inside the stones. Every detail came to him clearly. Components, strength, thermal conductivity, other properties, magical traits, even names and grades, the exact position of the core inside the rock, and where and how it should be processed, all laid out in his mind like a map. It did not feel like cheating, and he thought people in this world might naturally have such sharp eyes. This had to be an effect of arriving here. Everything had changed in his vision, and his eyes were now wide open in more ways than one. Freya did not understand what he meant. He blinked, she trembled as she said no one had divine eyes like his, and noted all his skills and craftsmanship. She wondered who he really was. Later, at the workshop, an explosion shook the ground. Fujimura rushed outside to check, wondering aloud whether they'd been hit by a missile, while Freya, trying to make sense of the situation, told him to stay back for a moment and then looked up. A monster sat on the workshop roof. She froze. An eyeless figure was here at midday, which made no sense. Then she noticed the stones and understood. The magic stones could have been drawn to their aura, and the eyeless ones let out a deafening screech. Freya panicked. They had to run. This thing was far too dangerous. Fujimura, unfazed, said if she did not deal with that stupid monster, it would blow a hole in her roof. She shouted that it would blow a hole in him. She warned him again. It was the same night demon that once destroyed the whole region. Worse, this one was a massive queen-class demon, and they didn't stand a chance. Fujimura calmly loaded his gun. Is that so? He asked. Freya insisted they leave immediately. Fujimura continued loading. She said that if it was that dangerous, she should take it out now. She stared at him and said, "Deal with it," then echoed the words in disbelief. The eyeless spread its wings and took off from the roof. It swoops toward them and lands with a heavy thud at their feet. Freya's eyes locked on its twisted mouth, pure terror on her face. Fujimura handed her the gun without hesitation and showed her how to hold it. Relax, it's light and easy to handle. Aim the barrel at the target, channel a bit of mana, use your index finger and pull the trigger. Hesitation held her back as she shook her head and said she could not do it. She was a healer, backline support, not a fighter. Not like this, paralyzed and trembling, holding the weapon terrified her. Fujimura stepped in front of her, placing himself between her and the eyeless. A gasp escaped her. The monster gasped too. She did not know what he was doing or why he was so close. He only grinned. "Believe in it," he said. Believe in the craft he poured 54 years into. 2 years of his life. Freya looked back and forth between him and the weapon. The eyeless one left again. She looked up. Now it was charging straight at them. Fujimura warned her to brace herself. She flinched but then raised the gun, her trembling hands pointing it toward the creature. The eyeless roared. Freya's mind raced. There was no way this tiny cylinder could stand up to that. Is the screened monster trapped inside? Fujimura shouted fire, her hands shaking as she squeezed the trigger. A bullet flew and detonated on impact, violent and blinding. Freya froze, unable to believe it. The monstrous eyeless lay motionless on the ground, a threat too terrifying to face head-on, now defeated by her hand. Her mind reeled at the outcome. Fujimura calmly inspected the aftermath with quiet satisfaction. The output stability test was complete. He credited the device to his patented magic stone manufacturing technique. It was more than a weapon, a refined piece of magical equipment that concentrated all the waste energy normally lost in a wand into a single focused burst. Every detail was designed meticulously, including a core bullet as the main offensive component, a core barrel to spin the shot and increase speed and range, and a magic stone casing that suppressed energy release until the moment of firing. He named it the Bakuin Fujimura, a name as explosive as its purpose. Patent pending, Freya stared at the device. It felt overwhelming and far too powerful. That's far too dangerous, Fujimura chuckled, saying it had given him quite a headache. For a long time its output was unstable, and he couldn't count how many times it nearly killed him during development, but now it was finally complete, and he added that when unloaded it could still cast healing magic like her old staff. He told her to try it. Freya tried to protest with "wait a second," but her words trailed off as she followed his gaze. Fujimura casually walked to a pile of fallen eyeless prototypes and surveyed the place where his discarded models had gathered, which had been his test site for the last 3 months, and he said proudly that his invention was safe, practical, usable by everyone from children to the elderly, the ideal tool in his eyes. Then he turned back to Freya. His face lit with energy. He said she should get ready because he planned to make her the world's strongest hero. Freya couldn't take it in. It made no sense. Fujimura pressed on, saying he would show the world his skills and that their ultimate prize would be the Demon King himself, plain and simple. That would make her the hero of her dreams, and him the greatest craftsman the world had ever seen, a win-win, and he burst out laughing. Freya froze, unable to make sense of his words as her thoughts spun, and everything felt so far from reality she couldn't keep up. He reached out his hand to her. She hesitated, unsure whether to try, because it felt impossible for someone like her to pull off something so legendary. Fujimura smiled and urged her on. He said the only thing left was to prepare to become a hero. This was the turning point. Freya felt stunned as he spoke of the Demon King like it was just another job, and despite how absurd his words sounded, something about this miracle craftsman made her heart race, and she heard it pounding in her chest. Slowly she reached out and took his hand. If he could really make it happen, she said she would follow him all the way. Fujimura Grand gave her hand a firm shake and said, "Right on, time to get going and give the world a huge shock." The monster rampaged as chaos swept across the battlefield. A man barked orders not to let it get away, saying if they could bring down the creature their party could have sinned to a rank, and he urged Frawl, the nickname he used for Freya, to hurry and be ready to heal. Freya wasn't watching the battle, cradling a wounded child and urgently channeling healing magic into him. When he saw it, he snapped, calling her worthless trash and scolding her for wasting magic on a mud-covered villager. Contempt filled his eyes. Freya pleaded that if she didn't act now the child would die. Her plea made no difference. The monster suddenly launched a brutal attack. Their Freya-turned eyes went wide as the blow came hurtling toward them. After the chaos died down, Freya woke with her head bandaged. As her vision cleared, she saw the same man standing over her. He said coldly that she was finally awake. The words shattered the last of her world. They told her she was no longer of any use to them. He said she always got in the way. Their quarry had escaped because of her. He called her a stupid bitch, and now she had to pay for it. Everything she'd saved up until now was confiscated. With her adventure rank erased, she was back at the bottom. He sneered as she fell from B-rank support to discarded baggage. That was her story now. She was on her own. He told her to do whatever she liked with the rest of her worthless life. Freya woke up with tears in her eyes. Sitting up in bed, overwhelmed, she steadied herself by imagining her mama, picturing her doing her best as always, still full of energy, and chasing the dream of becoming a hero. This time she was not alone, standing beside a miracle worker from another world. Fujimura was tinkering at his workbench and had just finished another invention, a megaphone. Freya held it curiously and asked what it was, and Fujimura explained that it was a tool that amplifies sound. The device converted electrical signals into physical vibrations, making her voice louder. He called it the Fujimura speaker. Pointing to the details, he explained he had used one core as the top plate and another as the main coil magnet. From machining to plastic processing, there was no core he could not shape, just like the old days. Machining meant using tools to cut and grind materials. Plastic processing meant using heat and other methods. Pressure to shape them. Inviting Freya to try it, he offered a little mana, pulled the trigger, told her to speak, and Freya hesitated before giving it a try. Her voice burst through the megaphone, booming like thunder. Startled, she jumped and covered her ears. It felt like lightning had struck nearby. Fujimura Grant announced the output adjustment was complete and mused that the magic stones were truly remarkable, their potential nearly limitless when used correctly. Maybe next he would build an engine, and Freya trembled. Doubt surfaced. She wondered why it had to be her to defeat the Demon King, and figured it would be faster if he did it himself, since he was a miracle worker. He was the one who deserved to be a hero, not her. Fujimura answered immediately, and he had no interest in being a hero because it felt like being an entertainer, tiring, full of attention and expectations, and far too much of a hassle. Besides, it would be far more interesting if she became the hero, a one-handed woman who is also a healer, an image both compelling and marketable. No matter how she saw it, a craftsman belonged behind the scenes, and that was where he thrived. In the end, what mattered was simple. People used what he made and were happy with the results. That was enough, and he changed the subject. Tom urged them to get moving and suggested they head into town. Freya felt surprised. She hadn't expected Fujimura to want to go to town. That reaction made him pause. He noticed her hesitation. After a moment, Freya composed herself and agreed to go. The two then arrived at their destination. Freya showed him Roraso Codornia, the region's capital. Buildings stretch along the busy roads. Life pulsed through the town as merchants shouted their deals and animals trotted through the streets. Laughter and conversation filled the air. Guards stood at their posts while people bustled in celebration. Fujimura took it all in. His eyes widened. This was exactly what he meant by a proper ice sky. Everything around him felt unfamiliar and exotic. Reaching for the dog, he jokingly called it over. "Come on, Fido, shake." And Freya pulled him aside to whisper that he had to avoid drawing attention because his foreign appearance already made him stand out. Fujimura retorted that she looked odd, pointing out she was bundled up under the blazing sun and probably sweating under there, and a flustered Freya said it was to cover her face and laughed awkwardly. He paused, then remembered her face and the burn scars he'd noticed when they first met, and she confirmed it quietly. She thought it must be nice for someone like him to speak so freely about what is on his mind. Shouting started right behind them. Two men were squaring off. One yelled, demanding to know what the killer belonged to. The man with the horn sneered back and called him a pissy deer anchor. Onlookers began to gather. Someone said a fight was about to break out. A deer anch swordsman was facing a C-ranked spear user. Fujimura Grant casually bet 5,000 Indo on the spear user. People said it felt like a festival, but Freya shook her head. Rarasa was really just a small kingdom despite being called the royal capital, and most of the time it was a quiet provincial town. Everything had changed recently when a second dungeon appeared in Codornia. Freya explained why it mattered. A century ago, the dungeon called Cavern Pass in Bo had appeared. Since the world's creation, underground labyrinths called dungeons have appeared across countries, each differing in terrain, layout, and complexity. Some plunged hundreds of floors and became more dangerous the deeper one descended. All shared one unchanging truth, the promise of monsters and treasure. Allure still produced new heroes. Dungeons attracted adventurers driven by dreams of wealth, glory, and the unknown. As adventurers gathered, trade and culture followed, and towns and cities grew around the mysterious ruins. The next day, a selection tournament called Fast would be held for this newly emerged dungeon. A competition decided who would earn the right to be the first to explore it. In the world of adventurers, the first person into a dungeon claimed all its treasure. Fast's goal was to be the very first to make contact with the unknown. Rumors said this dungeon held enough treasure to seize control of the whole country. It was the stuff of a true heroic saga. Fujimura nodded. That settled it. They would enter the tournament and seize this chance. They might even uncover some fascinating new stones while they were at it. Frey's eyes widened in disbelief. That was impossible. Adventurers from across the nation and even neighboring realms would be gathering for this. The rules allowed parties of up to 5 members, but they had only 2, and to make matters worse, A-rank parties would be competing, so she knew the odds were steep. Fujimura didn't flinch and told Freya not to worry. The Baku Fuji, the weapon of absolute destruction, was on her side. Freya panicked anyway. If she used such a powerful weapon in public, she'd probably be arrested in front of everyone for mass murder. Not realizing she'd said it out loud, someone nearby spotted her. Fujimura looked around after someone pointed out Freya, and more people were staring. Someone else confirmed it. That's her. Those burn scars are a dead giveaway. It's Freya the betrayer. People whispered she abandoned her team in the middle of battle and ran away. Once a B-rank adventurer, she had fallen to a solo F-ranker. No one would trust a traitor like her. Worse, while fleeing a monster, she barely escaped with her life and lost a hand in the process. People muttered she was a disgrace to adventurers. Fujimura heard it all, chuckled, patted Frey on the back, and told him to ignore those people like adults, but the crowd kept talking and calling him a mouthy brappy. No way he's part of her new party. Probably just a lost kid who looks kind of stupid with mean little eyes and maybe a new goblin type. Fujimura raised an eyebrow. The goblin looked himself over and told Freya to hand over the gun. A sudden urge to try the rapid-fire mode hit him. Freya stopped him immediately, not in his current condition. Another group arrived. One of them smiled cruelly and said it was a surprise to see such a familiar face here. It was good to see Freya was as useless as ever, he added. Freya's eyes widened. That voice was familiar. Her old party, the A-rank team, recognized it too. Valk Donner was the man speaking, the dual swordsman. Those nearby grew excited. It's Sword Flash for sure. They say they're about to reach S-rank. They're Rorasso's pride and the top favorites for Fast. Freya lowered her eyes in shame. Valk acted friendly and said it was nostalgic to see her again. He then teased her, saying that little brat was the best she could find for a new party. Leaning in, he whispered that someone like her couldn't build a real team anymore, not after the rumors he'd spread. Frey's eyes widened in shock as she remembered he was the one who started the rumors that ruined her. Vox had said that even if she was trash, she had been a decent healer, and he would have been annoyed if she joined someone else. That's why he made sure she couldn't. Freya stayed quiet as Vox turned to leave and told her to keep doing her best to chase her hero dreams, then added one more cruel line that your dear mama is watching from heaven and laughed as he walked off. Fujimura looked annoyed and muttered that Frey never told him about a jerk like Fok. The crowd gasped when that brat called Valkyzerk, and Valk turned to look at him. Fujimura stood tall and said he didn't care about all that A and Beer Inc. stuff, adding that judging people by rank or looks was just dumb, and even called Valky kid. Everyone was shocked, including you. People began to complain. That brat is the rude one. He's the real kid here. Apologize to Valk, goblin boy. People asked what kind of school he attended. Everyone urged Vok to put Fujimura in his place, and Vok's Goff said Fujimura was exactly what he expected from a trader's companion, immature and disrespectful. He changed the subject. Their presence meant they were entering the selection tournament too. Fujimura smiled. They sure are. The young lady isn't though. Vok smirked. Good luck then. Be careful of any accidents. Fujimura grinned back. Same to you. Let a guess go. She called his name in shock. Later at the arena. Excitement filled the air as people packed the seats and cheered loudly. At the center, the adventurers stood ready. Guards kept a close watch at night. Some people spotted Fujimura. That's them, the ones who picked a fight with Sheridan, the F-rank healer, and that loud brat. The kid looks strange. His clothes are odd and smoke seems to be coming from his mouth. In the distance, Fox smiled softly. At the front, Knight unrolled a scroll. Music played in the background. That night, the announcement was read aloud. In an instant, the crowd erupted. The phase selection tournament was officially underway. Fujimura contacted Freya to learn the quickest way to defeat the Demon King. Freya was surprised by his phrasing when he spoke of the quickest way. Fujimura said a good craftsman always aims for speed and that it's a matter of pride in their profession. Freya then explained that, no matter his intentions, Fujimura must first attain SS rank before he can enter the Demon King's domain. Only then can he proceed. The elite rank called Sun was reserved for the 7 greatest adventurers in the world, who bore humanity's hopes and had exclusive access to Idzuma, the most dangerous front line against demonic forces. They were more than adventurers, almost called true heroes. At the center of a grand arena, the phase selection tournament was about to begin. A knight announced the start and invited anyone who wanted to participate to enter the ring. Someone in the crowd glanced at Freya, and a shiver ran down her spine. A wave of anxiety tightened around her as she questioned why she was in such a hostile, intimidating place. Whispers rippled through the crowd, mocking voices naming her and Fujimura and sneering that no one would help her and the kid, that they were really picking a fight with Sheridan and badly underestimating Fast. Freya felt those doubts again, unsure she had any right to stand there, and nervously bumped into someone. A towering man in full armor. The armored man felt the impact and looked puzzled. Freya froze in terror. Another adventurer drew his sword, indignant and demanding to know who had been so rude. Panicked, Freya ducked behind Fujimura and kept apologizing. The large man looked at Fujimura, called him kin, and paused. Looking at Fujimura with exaggerated concern, he asked aloud why children would be in a place like this and whether he was lost. His parents were missing, the nights felt empty, and the poor child trembled with fear. Fujimura did not tremble with fear. Boiling with rage, he grabbed Freya's mouth, faced the giant, and in a sharp, confrontational tone demanded the man listen, called him a megagazer, and then introduced himself and Freya with full confidence, declaring their names sacred and that they would beat the Demon King to pulp. Laughter followed. The name Megajezer drew a few amused reactions, but most people thought Fujimura's claim ridiculous, calling him a lunatic for invoking the Demon King, and muttering that this was exactly the kind of madness they'd expect from the betrayer's party. Amused, the enormous man called an infestation responded sarcastically, noting how nice it was that children still dared to dream. Murmurs of disgust continued from the crowd, dismissive and scornful. Held the massive man's gaze without flinching. The large man suddenly exhaled, sending an overpowering foul breath into the air. Groans rose from those nearby. Fujimura, unamused, coldly asked what kind of trick this lousy old man was trying to pull now. The enormous man stared at Fujimura and saw a sharpness in his eyes that did not belong to an ordinary warrior. Suddenly his tone and manner changed. He bowed respectfully, called Fujimura master, and apologized for treating him like a child moments earlier. Gandalf introduced himself as the leader of the B-class adventuring party called Gardener and pointed to the 2 warriors behind him, the twin swordsmen Jin and Ken. Gandalf greeted Fujimura and Freya and said he hoped that if they faced each other in the upcoming selection tournament, their match would be fair, intense, and fought with everything they had. Cheers erupted from the onlookers. The word heated echoed through the crowd and drew laughter. The mood shifted. Freya said Gandalf seemed surprisingly decent. Fujimura stayed silent. I was sharp and unreadable. High above the arena, a knight watched the commotion while his mind wandered. Finally, the phase selection tourney had arrived. He half regretted not placing a bet. In Codornia, Sheridan is always the reigning favorite. After a quick mental calculation, he figured that leaving his post at once might still get him there in time to place a bet. But he reconsidered, because if the captain caught him slacking again, there would be severe punishment, and the man had no patience for jokes. Suddenly something below the fortress drew his gaze, movement in the trees and figures emerging from the forest shadows. First 3, then more and more. Monsters swarmed, and his eyes widened in horror. Ringing the alert bell, he shouted that a monster horde had appeared. Down below, Fujimura noticed the sudden alarm and muttered under his breath in confusion. Frey guessed they were probably masked, and Fujimura asked what that meant. Freya explained that, although the full reasons are unknown, a new dungeon somehow triggers the local monsters. Occasionally that makes them gather in large numbers and stampede toward the dungeon, an event called the Mast. Fujimura took it in stride and commented dryly on the twist of fate. Freya reassured him, saying that although they were on the frontier, this was still the royal capital. Royal knights were posted here, and many powerful adventurers had gathered for the tournament, so the monsters would be driven off or lose interest before they could do serious harm. After several nights together, one arrived panting heavily, and the others asked what the rush was, saying if it was only a mast it would be over soon, but he shook his head because something was wrong. From the watchtower he said he'd made a quick count, over 1,000 monsters, easily. Most were goblins, but there were ogres among them and they'd Get to the capital in just 30 minutes. The news hit everyone like a thunderclap. 1,000, equal to a siege force from one of the 5 great dungeons. A tall figure laughed. Valk stepped forward, amused, and suggested turning the situation into an impromptu competition where whoever defeated the most monsters would claim the phase tournament title. Dungeons and monsters had always belonged to adventurers, not bureaucrats, so they bent the rules a little. Everyone present would benefit. They'd gain glory and could even be hailed as national heroes for saving the capital. Whispers rippled through the crowd. The box idea made sense. Murmurs turned to excitement. They had Chardon, the strongest among them. Confidence surged. If the knights had a problem with it, they would not fight. This was now an adventurer's challenge. After a brief pause, the knights issued their verdict, while Vox stood confidently with an unwavering grin. Officials changed the tournament rules on the spot and turned the phase selection tourney into a live battlefield, a high-risk A-rank mission called the Master Pulsion Battle. The King of Rarasa approved the decision, turning a simple contest into a formal request from the kingdom, and the adventurers, sworn to defend the realm, had to prove the full extent of their strength and resolve. Freya froze, her thoughts spinning. Everything had escalated too fast. Moments ago it had just been a tournament, now it was war. The signal arrived, the order to open the gates. There was no time to hesitate, so the battle began. A wave of adventurers charged toward the approaching horde. Most of the enemy ranks were goblins. Blades clashed and magic flashed as screams and roars filled the air. Shaiden's party reached the battlefield. Valk activated several buffs to boost his team's strength, reaction speed, magic resistance, and agility. Confused, the goblin paused. One calm order from Va put his team into motion. Determined to crush the enemy, he lunged forward and cut down goblins with practiced grace. His companions did the same, striking with deadly precision. The clash of steel rang out. One woman cut through monster after monster so skillfully that she stood out even in the chaos. Arrows whistled through the air as archers rained death from above. The battle's coordinated chaos never let up. Trembling at the edge, Freya could not move. Fujimura grabbed her roughly and snapped her out of the stupor, demanding to know what was taking her so long and why she was not out there helping. Freya stammered, frozen with fear. Admitting she never belonged in the selection tourney, her attention went to a collapsed adventurer nearby. Covered in blood and barely breathing. Instinctively, she ran to his side. Kneeling beside him, her arms trembled as she supported his weight. She used her gun to shoot the adventurer and heal him. A wounded adventurer coughed up blood and lay barely conscious when Frey's healing light surged through him, steadying his breath and closing his wounds. Disbelief was etched on his face as he stared at her. Healing at that level, that speed was beyond what he thought possible. A new threat loomed behind Freya as a goblin crept up with its weapon raised, and Fujimura yelled at her, calling her a bloody idiot and warning her to watch her six. Freya barely had time to react when the goblin fell dead at her feet. Gandalf had arrived. Signaling Kin and Jin, his twin blades, he sent them into action and they cut down the goblins around Freya, clearing the area in seconds. Gandalf turned to her and asked if she was unharmed. Freya nodded, grateful. Gandalf asked whether she was truly satisfied with this. If she kept only patching wounds from the rear, she would lose her chance to participate in Fast. Freya paused, then smiled. A healer, she said she could not ignore anyone who collapsed before her, no matter who they were. That was how she was. Freya remembered her mother as a powerful, gentle woman who always put others first. If her mother were alive, Freya believed she would have done the same. Gandalf asked about this woman. Freya replied that her name was Mers von Freya, a woman she revered. A woman she hoped to surpass one day. Frey didn't just want to defeat the Demon King. To her, a true hero was someone who became a beacon of hope for the weak. Gandalf nodded slowly when he heard the name, having long heard stories about Mars von Freya. She was a woman of noble northern lineage and the first female member of the elite salon. Known as the Flame Princess, Mars von Freya was a renowned healer and the genius architect of the culminating flame, a legendary magic. Wartime records said she fell 15 years ago, killed in the Great War against the demons. He never imagined her bloodline could have survived or that her kin would show up here. Gandalf stood still and slowly scratched his helmet. Turning to Freya, he told her to stop worrying and focus only on getting better, assuring her they would keep her safe. Freya was clearly taken aback by his words. Gandalf believed it was simple. The ideals and dreams of the younger generation deserve protection. That was also the responsibility of those who had lived through the fires of the past. Fujimura smirked, tapped his wrench lightly against Gandalf's armor, and said Gandalf was exactly right. Then, in typical Fujimura fashion, he offered a playful invitation that once they made it out alive, they would share a drink, since he figured booze would go down smoothly with someone like Gandalf. Gandalf paused, then let out a laugh, even in such a grim. An hour later, Fujimura had the nerve to talk about banquets, and Gandalf agreed, so may that promise help them both survive this chaos. Kin, standing nearby, stepped in and reminded Fujimura it was Gandalf-san, not Gandalf-chan, telling him to stop using childish suffixes, and Fujimura grinned at Kin's presence and jokingly called him Kintaro, making Kin flinch, and before the exchange could continue, another presence approached. Valk stepped forward with a sneer, eyes locked on Freya, and offered mock praise for her persistence, saying her healing powers had clearly improved since their last encounter. And to think, after he'd spread rumors calling her a traitor and arranged her banishment, she still stubbornly refused to disappear, and he called all that effort and those lies a waste. Gandalf's eyes narrowed as he asked Valk to tell him about the rumors. He wanted to hear those stories if Valk didn't mind, but Valk brushed the question aside, said it was fine, and then vanished without warning. In an instant, he reappeared behind Gandalf and stabbed him in the back. Freya froze in horror when the blade twisted, blood gushed from Gandalf's mouth, and his knees buckled. Valkyrie said coldly that Gandalf would die either way. Then he turned to Freya and began to speak, saying the world belonged to the powerful, and people were trained and conditioned to believe the stories of the strong, so no one would care about a pathetic party made up of an F-rank healer and a worthless kid. Their story would never gain traction. Kin and Jin immediately struck back with blades drawn. Before they could land a blow, a violent surge of electricity engulfed them. Both collapsed behind Valk. One of his companions gave a mocking apology, saying she had slipped up and caused some unfortunate friendly fire. Such things happened in the chaos of battle, and another member of Shaiden's party laughed and agreed, since they could also end up landing accidental blows. Freya stood frozen, unable to take in what she had just witnessed. Valk turned to Fujimura and declared that weakness was a sin. The weak should remain silent, obey, and submit to the strong like the slaves they were born to be. That was the natural order of things. The boy understood now. This was how the world really worked. Fujimura stayed unmoved and said coolly. He suggested Va try being born a bit smarter in his next life. Vok struck, but his sword stopped in midair because Fujimura had blocked it easily. He held it steady with his wrench. Vok's eyes went wide. He hadn't expected this. Fujimura stared him down. No fear, no respect. He muttered that no matter where he ended up, he always ran into the same kind of trash, and for once he was glad they were in another world. Back in his own, everyone constantly complained about power harassment and moral harassment. From now on, he announced, they would demonstrate a style. Confused, Valk asked what that meant. Fujimura answered simply that punks get beaten up. Vok's smirk lingered as he teased Fujimura. A brief flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. A moment earlier, his A-class sword strike had been stopped. That wasn't a fluke. The boy had blocked the attack with one hand, which should not have been possible. It wasn't just reaction speed. Fujimura read the strike and parried it as if it were nothing. Frey had seen it too, that impossible reaction, the confident dance. Fujimura stayed calm and steady and dared Valk to show more, to give everything he had. His confidence wasn't unfounded. Before arriving in the royal capital, Fujimura had tested his wrench, Kangaparent, on a large mantis monster. Freya had wondered what he was doing as he approached a hostile insectoid beast with only a wrench, and he had replied casually that he was experimenting. When the man slouched toward him, he moved. Fluid and unafraid, Fujimura countered its ferocious slashes with precise blows from the wrench, and Freya could hardly believe it. Fujimura's single swing smashed the mantis, sending it tumbling. On the ground, it twitched, defeated. Studying the weapon in his hand, he nodded with satisfaction and declared it finished, saying he would call her Kangaparun from now on. When Freya asked about the strange name, he said Purin was short for pipe wrench, a tool with dual jaws to grip and turn round pipes. His interest wasn't the function but the shape, thick, balanced, brutal, built for slugging, and he was itching for a reason to swing it in combat, while Freya, still surprised, noted how fast and cleanly he moved with just one hand. Fujimura revealed the weapon was no ordinary piece. It combined material reinforcement with physical enhancement as the world's first double-core product. Its design made up for the extra weight by boosting his strength so he could wield it effortlessly. There was more. He tapped the side of his head. Like mine, his vision changed after years spent closely studying stones and intricate work. He focused so intensely that time seemed to slow, calling it the Shinsekigen, the Godspeed Eye. A tool that allowed him to see everything. Freya went silent as she returned to the present. Fujimura snapped her out of it. He pointed to the fallen Gandalf and the unconscious twins. If she didn't act now, those old men were done for. She could still save them. Of all people, he trusted her. It was all free and needed. She left without hesitation. Vox stood still as she walked away, then turned his attention back to Fujimura. Fujimura was just standing there, casually lighting a cigarette. Valkorind issued his threat. It was the end for Fujimura. Valkorind would make him regret ever underestimating adults. They were about to tear him apart, but before the attack began, something fell from the sky. A body was found. A Vox companion caught sight of it. More details soon. More of a reflex than concern. Holding the figure up, he sneered and laughed at the bloody, broken mess in his hands, wondering who this lowlife was and where this filthy piece of trash had come from. A sudden clatter of panicked footsteps came from behind them, and people were running, adventurers, knights, and veterans all fleeing in the opposite direction. Shouts and screams echoed across the field. The battlefield had shifted. Something was coming. It was even worse. The body landed hard in front of Valk, and he crouched to grab the man's head. Amused, he taunted the man for rushing and acted like it wasn't a big deal. Pale and trembling, the man managed only 2 words. "It's here." Fought frowned and asked what was here. Almost incoherent with fear, he stammered that he didn't know how it had happened, called it a monster, and wondered why such a creature would be in such a remote place. Then came the sound of a deep footstep from Funder. A vast shadow swept over the area as the air shifted, darkening by the second. A senior adventurer cried out in panic with an estimated subjugation rank of Special A, and the name fell like a curse: the Lord of the Black Forest, ruler of the goblins. The Goblin Lord stepped into view, massive and towering, radiating a terrifying presence. Before the adventurers could decide, panicked orders rang out as fire, magic, and arrows filled the air, hurtling toward the towering figure, but the Goblin Lord did not flinch. It lifted a colossal, jagged weapon, cruel and far too large for any human to wield. It came down like divine judgment. The ground split, screams filled the air, dozens were crushed instantly, and chaos followed. One of Vox's companions, eyes wide with disbelief, asked what they were supposed to do now. That thing was not just dangerous, it was impossible. Vox answered coldly and sharply that this had always been their goal, and they had always intended to break into the S rank. This was their chance. Kill that monster and the face would be theirs. The timing couldn't be better. He looked at the knights and adventurers who had fled to their side for cover. They hoped Sheridan would defend them and that their elite reputations would matter now. Valkyrin realized grimly they had just become the perfect supply of meat shields. The rest of the Sheridan party laughed excitedly as their bloodlust rose. Valk turned to Fujimura, flashing a mocking smile and calling him lucky, saying he would not die yet. Once they tore the Goblin Lord apart, they would return to finish him, and Valk offered Fujimura a chance to run as far as he wanted. It made no difference. They would catch up sooner or later. Then a sharp crack echoed across the field, a single shot. Vox's ears twitched. It wasn't an attack, it was healing. Freya stood at a distance holding her healing rifle, taking position and firing again and again at the wounded sprawled across the ground. Each shot sparked a glimmer of recovery, slashed torsos mending, broken limbs realigning, shallow breaths growing steady. The Goblin Lord pressed forward. Freya kept going. Fujimura turned to her and asked if she was okay. Her breathing was ragged and her hands were trembling. He warned that there was a limit to how much mana she could burn, and if she kept this pace, she wouldn't last much longer. Freya was gasping for air and drenched in sweat. She answered him anyway and kept firing no matter what. She couldn't stop. Fujimura gave a wry smile. He had no choice then, so he would go all in too to protect her. Even if it was just her, even if she was the only one left, he would protect her with everything he had. From a distance, Fox Nordit's lip curled at the sight of them, hopeless and clinging to empty ideals, playing savior in a world ruled by power, beyond help and just trash trying to carry other trash. Fine, let them heal and revive a few more bodies. He could always use more meat shields. He turned to his comrades in the Sheridan party, ice gleaming. It was time. They would take everything the battlefield offered and sweep aside anything in their way. The battlefield was filled with fighting that day. Everyone joined forces to fight the monsters. At last, the extermination was complete. The adventurers reacted with triumph. A boot came down hard on the fallen monster's body. Vox summed it up, assessing the battle's outcome with satisfaction, attributing the victory to Shiden, and concluding that fast was now virtually secured. Fujimura checked in on Freya. She nodded, her body trembling with exhaustion. He watched her with mild exasperation, seeing that she had pushed herself too far. Valk approached and praised the others' efforts, especially Freya, who had been tirelessly healing the wounded throughout the fight. Even after everything, they had lost some of their own. Valk looked at the fallen companion, El Tico, dismissed them as a failure, and said it was over for them. He began talking about the future now that the elf was gone. Before he could finish, Freya raised the healing gun and aimed it at Eltiko's lifeless body. Her sudden action caught Fujimura off guard. Before Valk could act, a permitted discharge erupted. LTCO's eyes snapped open. Vox stopped mid-step, sneered into staste, and walked away. Other adventurers stood around them in silence. Freya collapsed face first from the strain. Fujimura cried out in alarm. Soon after, the city erupted into celebration. As Valken and his party walked through the streets, townspeople hailed them as the saviors of Roraso, returning triumphantly, and girls called out for Vox's attention. Whispers ran through the crowd that Vox party had defeated even a goblin lord, with someone saying Shredden landed the final blow, and others saying Vox party was on a whole different level. Later, at a formal gathering, the knights announced that the right to Feist would be granted to those who had shown distinguished service in the repulsion battle, and although the king would make the final decision based on recommendations from the adventurers who took part, everyone already expected Shredden to be chosen. The knights immediately named those who had earned the right to challenge the new dungeon, Embo. When the announcement came, Vox's thoughts turned inward and urged fate to grant the reward he wanted, believing Feist would bring recognition, trust and power, give him the platform to rise to S-class or even attain the legendary Salyuan, and he invited the world, including those beneath him, the insignificant masses, to watch the rise of a true hero. The knight fell silent, then called for Frau on Freya to step forward. Both Freya and Valk were stunned, and Valk stared in disbelief. Valk tried to process what he'd just heard, and it made no sense that a traitor like her would be summoned that way, so he clenched his teeth as his anger grew. Disbelief settled over him. Someone so weak who couldn't even fight was named the Fist. He felt she had no right to the title, and that it had to be the result of a recommendation. He wondered who would betray him like this after all he had done slaying the behemoth, and he saw this as his reward. One of Vox's comrades stepped in to calm him, telling him to let it go. A nearby traveler overheard the commotion and looked confused. They said Vox was acting as if he had taken down the monster on his own. They clearly thought Vox was letting his A-class status go to his head, and he burned with fury at being insulted by these nobodies until someone else spoke up and said it was time Vox faced the truth. Everyone owed their survival to her efforts, so the crowd chose to stand behind her. Valk couldn't believe what he heard and wondered when so many people had started supporting Freya. Fujimura stepped up behind Freya and patted her on the back in congratulations, teasing her about her new status and calling her Miss Feist. Freya was still in disbelief. Valk lashed out in protest. Calling it absurd, he demanded the king's presence and said he would only accept the decision if it came directly from the king himself. Gandalf stepped forward and told Vox to give up. The matter had already been settled. Vox turned on him with contempt and said he didn't want to hear anything from an old fool like Gandalf, who had no authority here. The knights then raised their spears and aimed them at Valk. He stared at them in disbelief, wondering what they thought they were doing. Gandalf chuckled at Vox's ignorance. It was Zainal. Vox's perception was clearly lacking. With a slow, deliberate motion, Gandalf removed his helmet. Ken and Jin dropped to their knees before him, leaving Valk stunned, and Ken told Valk to show respect. Before him stood the 17th King of Rarasa, His Majesty Lord Gandalf de Rarasa. The revelation left Freya and Fujimura speechless. Gandalf turned to Fujimura and reminded him of the promise they had made, saying he was ready for the banquet Fujimura had mentioned and expected him to join that night. Frey's shock only deepened. Gandalf laughed and admitted that adventuring had always been a hobby, since the front lines had been too quiet lately. Fujimura chuckled awkwardly and admitted Ganshin had really caught him off guard. Kin, visibly scandalized, demanded that Fujimura stop referring to the Falk suddenly realized he had stabbed Gandalf, and his eyes widened in panic. Behind him, Gandalf spoke with a calm authority, saying it was a shame and that soon tales of Vox's disgrace would spread far and wide. He acknowledged Vox's strength, but strength alone was never enough. Without heart, the world was just a hollow shell. Gandalf turned to Freya, the face of the nation and more precisely, a true hero, and expected only one thing. Gandalf and everyone behind him knelt before her. Gandalf continued. He sought the spirit of someone who grows stronger for others, not himself, a righteous heart. Unbreakable, steadfast, and full of noble resolve. Freya stood motionless, speechless. Her hand stayed at her side. The question that had haunted her for so long filled her mind. It seemed impossible for someone like her to be a hero. She bowed her head and remembered all the things people had said about her. Fujimura rested his arm casually over her shoulder and remarked that, in the end, she was chosen not because she fought. But because she hadn't, she became a one-handed F-rank adventurer, burned and scarred, a loner hated across the kingdom. After all she had endured, Freya now had something to be proud of. Her body trembled as she gritted her teeth while Gandalf washed with a gentle smile. At last Freya broke down in tears. Gandalf spoke to her one last time and told her to keep walking forward as she had been doing, because she had always been on the right path. That night the Vox fake was sealed. Gandalf, Fujimura, and the others celebrated while he sank into disgrace, and the feast stayed lively late into the night. Gandalf, drunk and beaming, told the crowd to enjoy themselves without restraint, announcing the drinks came from the royal treasury and were free for everyone to enjoy. Fujimura, amused and slightly tipsy, joked it was a generous tax rebate and playfully smacked Gandalf on the head. Kin, shocked by the gesture, protested that Fujimura had no right to lay hands on the king. Ken spotted a bug before his anger could continue and let out a shrill shriek. Flustered, Ken asked why the king would hold a banquet in such a humble place. When an adventurer offered him a drink, Ken indignantly insisted the event should have been held in the castle with proper dignity. Gandalf dismissed the idea that he hated the stiff, formal air of the royal palace. Fujimura praised him for finally loosening up and handed him another drink. Kin, once more taken aback, reacted strongly to Fujimura's overfamiliar attitude. He turned and reminded a nearby guard that she was an imperial officer and should behave accordingly. Jin was drinking heavily. A nearby man watched in amazement, saying she could really hold her liquor and calling her a beast. Fujimura called to Kin again, urging him to drink. Kin pushed his hand away and told him to stop bothering him. Freya chuckled softly at their antics. A group of adventurers soon approached Freya, praising her extraordinary healing in the battle and saying their ability to sit and enjoy drinks afterward was all thanks to her. Someone said that, thanks to the king's influence, Freya had been restored to her rank. They laughed at themselves, admitting they had been fools for believing the ridiculous rumors about her for so long. Freya replied modestly, brushing it off with a shy blush. One adventurer clenched his fist and said the next time he saw Valk he would punch him with the fist of justice. A nearby person dismissed the threat, doubting he had it in him. A different adventurer shifted the focus back to Frey's abilities. They said that with someone like her on the field, even if the front lines were overwhelmed, they would be back on their feet in no time. Frey's thoughts turned inward as she pictured the front lines, the border between humanity and the demons called Azuma. Someone nearby scoffed and said going to Azuma was a dream at best. The demons were monstrously powerful, but bodies that regenerated, skin as hard as steel, and mana that never ran out belonged to an army under the Demon King. It was organized with 6 generals commanding 18 divisions. Worse, they were intelligent, spoke human languages, and could fly. Even a single division commander, they said, would need 5 S-rank adventurers to have any chance. No ordinary fighter would last 5 minutes against them. At that moment, Fujimura stepped forward. Fujimura was curious about what the group was discussing before Freya could answer. He suddenly started crying. Fujimura told Freya he had always known she could handle it. He praised her drive and determination and called her a real go-getter. Freya was surprised by his sudden praise. He added that he was proud of her success. Nearby, another adventurer admired how well Fujimura held his liquor. That was not bad at all. A large man suddenly grabbed Freya's head. Scoffing as he looked down at her, he refused to accept that this counted as face material. She was a healer who couldn't even beat a single enemy, not something to celebrate. To him, she was a helpless woman propped up by praise and status. Mocking her, he suggested he might take her place. Fujimura clenched his teeth, but before things escalated further, a hand clamped onto the big man's arm. The man spun around, startled. He flinched, suddenly nervous, as a woman stood before him with a composed expression. A presence shimmered under the lights. The adventurers around them stood in awe. They wondered who the stunning beauty was and whether she'd been there the whole time. Dazzling and almost unreal, she drew admiring looks even from Freya. Scoffing, the big man asked the elf woman what her problem was, whether she wanted something from him, and if she wanted to talk in his room. The elf woman said nothing and leaned back. She slammed her forehead against his. The man collapsed instantly, unconscious. Freya stood frozen in shock. Fujimura, however, was clearly entertained. The elf woman stood her ground and declared she would never tolerate any insult toward Frau. Freya was stunned. She wondered how the woman knew her name and if they had met before, because the woman did more than just ask who the elf was. The elf woman lifted her mask, and Frey's eyes widened in recognition. Miss Altico announced that from that day on she would join Freya and Fujimura on their journey, and Freya turned to Fujimura to confirm Altico was joining them. Jamura did not object, especially after the headbutt, which was enough to win him over, so he reached into his bag to change the mood, pulled out a bottle, held it up proudly, and said it was time to open it. When Freya asked, he said it was genuine Japanese sake. the one bottle he had brought from back home, a top-quality piece finished with precise chamfering, and Freya learned that chamfering was a metalworking technique that smoothed sharp edges to improve grip, appearance, safety, and ease of assembly. Freyam realized this explained why Fujimura had delayed earlier and gone home so determinedly. Before the banquet, he had told her to wait a bit because he had something only a man could do, and she muttered to herself that it had all been for this. Fujimura laughed and held the bottle up in triumph. Since she met him, her destiny had started to shift, just a bit, so to show gratitude, she told him she could indulge him a little. A woman bumped into Fujimura, her chest pressing against him as she praised the drink, calling it delicious. Fujimura agreed, saying it was his dad's little slice of heaven, and when another woman asked his age he said 70, which stunned her and made her say she couldn't believe it, while Frey remained quietly in the background. On impulse, she grabbed a bottle, took a swig straight from it, and said she would drink too. The others cheered for her. Laughing, Fujimura warned her not to push herself too hard. Later, Freya slumped onto the couch, and Fujimura chuckled at how quickly she had given in to the drink. Lightweight, he shook his head, saying sleeping like that would only make her sick and muttering that she'd catch a cold, and El Tico heard the word cold. Naginiji stepped in, said she would warm Freya, and gently laid a blanket over the sleeping girl. Fujimura praised her as a real pro, saying, "Nice stuff, Naginiji," while El Tico looked down at Freya's peaceful sleeping face. Without warning, she began to undress, and Fujimura panicked and told her to stop, thinking she had already done enough and that Freya was fine as she was. Someone wondered if this elf was a natural airhead, and a voice in the crowd grumbled, called Fujimura a stupid brat, and demanded to know why he stopped El Tico, but Fujimura cut off the noisy crowd with a sharp retort and told them to be quiet. The next day, knights stood at attention, lined up in full regalia before the great gates. Regal and composed, Gandalf walked beside Fujimura and Freya as they prepared to leave, offered a formal farewell, entrusted them with the task ahead, and urged them to be cautious, saying everyone left behind would pray for their safety and good health. Fujimura replied in his usual casual cheer, called him Ganchan, and promised that when he returned he'd have a cracking story Gandalf could look forward to. Frey drifted toward her destination, Imbo, a new dungeon world full of hidden layers and secrets waiting to be uncovered, yet something kept nagging at her. She remembered the strange way the mast had been summoned, and knew the labyrinth might have appeared by coincidence or as a direct response to Mr. Fujimura's reincarnation, and whatever the truth she couldn't afford to hold back and would need to give everything she had, so Fujimura called to Freya and El Tico, telling them it was time to move. It was time to hunt for treasure. Tragedy shaped her life and a cursed fate followed her, and her name is El Tico. Born an elf, she had almost no mana, a black-haired child who became an ill omen among her kin and was marked as a heretic by her own people. No one knew where she came from. No memory of her birthplace, no parents, no welcome, only scorn as a child. Other elves kicked her to the ground and laughed as she fell. That ridicule followed her as she grew up, never letting her forget how different she was. Alone and unwanted, she accepted the cold truth that she didn't belong. The tournament came back to her, the moment she hit the ground with her body broken. Fox's voice rang in her ears, the name El Tico coming to mind as a waste of space, while her consciousness faded. She accepted his scorn as fact, convinced she was worthless and that it was just the way things were. At that exact moment, a shot rang out and her eyes opened wide. Someone had saved her, reaching out not from duty or for glory but from genuine devotion, and for the first time in her life she felt what it was like to be valued. At that moment, she resolved to protect that human. At the dungeon gates, night had fallen, 3 days had passed. They wondered how deep they would go. Phased recipients had 5 days of priority access to the dungeon, he recalled. After that, it would be open to everyone else. He considered abandoning his knighthood to become an adventurer. In his daydream, he imagined finally paying off his house. An explosion shattered the silence. Smoke billowed from the dungeon, a foot appeared, then a man stepped out and took a deep breath, savoring the fresh air as the night fell silent and his eyes widened. Returning from the depths were the face and her team, Freya, El Tico, and Fujimura. Freya coughed in the thick air and wondered what was fresh about it. El Tico handed her a cloth and suggested she wipe her nose. Fujimura said the crab on the bottom floor had been a tenacious foe. Freya confirmed it was the dungeon master. El Tico added that it had been quite tasty. The knights scrambled to report back to the king, and word spread quickly that the Feist had returned and had successfully traversed the dungeon. The king arrived on time. Freya presented a full report on the dungeon layers, creatures, and resources. The king and his advisors were left speechless. Fujimura Chimden proudly showed a ring set with a glowing gem. He had gathered several powerful stones. Freya realized the king wasn't only surprised by their quick return, the king was stunned by what they had found. The king asked hesitantly whether that was the legendary SS-grade magic stone, the transition crystal. Fujimura confirmed it, but said its power was limited. It could only teleport someone to places they had already visited. Still, he added that nothing beat a hot bath after dungeon diving. A circular light appeared beside him. Reaching into the portal, he pulled out a bag. The king recognized the magic again as a spatial storehouse, another mythical great stone. Fujimura casually said he had found many more interesting stones and was eager to bring them back to the workshop. The king reeled at the implications. 2 SS-grade stones had been recovered from a dungeon in his kingdom, one the legendary transition crystal once held by a great hero, and the thought of other nations finding out made him faint. 2 of the king's men watched with sharp eyes and whispered that it was a huge opportunity. 2 mythical stones on one expedition seemed unbelievable, so they approached Fujimura with forced smiles and casually asked if he would take them along next time. Before Fujimura could answer, a shadow fell over them as something came down fast, and he saw a massive shape above. He barked an order to move. Only one obeyed. The man with braided hair stayed where he was. The object slammed down on him. Dust burst into the air, and Fujimura shielded his face, coughing as he looked up. A massive object rose from the impact site, stretching up like a grotesque sculpture. His eyes fixed on it in horror. Its shape was unrecognizable and made him recoil. The surviving man ran to his companion's remains. Only the lower half of the body remained. Panicked, he ran to Freya and begged her for help. Freya clenched her fists. She bit her trembling lip. In her current state, she could not help him. Once someone died, she could do nothing. The man wept in horror. Freya began to cry as well. She trembled with despair as the towering structure before them began to split, cracks spreading like veins across its surface. A sinister hiss came from inside. El Tico's breath caught, and a chill ran down her spine as Claude's bony skeletal hands pushed through the cracks. A grotesque supernatural form appeared. Its face was gaunt, and its eyes burned with an unnatural gleam. The creature fixed its gaze on Freya, who stood frozen with her chest rising and falling in quick, panicked breaths, and hissed again. It then spoke, demanding to know what kind of stones they had found. Soldiers stared in disbelief. The monster could speak. The king's eyes widened in horror. He realized they faced a variant, an intelligent demon. A member of the demon clan sneered. It said the demon lord had noticed strange activity in his cave and sent him to investigate. With each word, more of its arms cracked into place. It was unnaturally long and twisted, its joints popping as if they were reforming themselves. Then it lifted its many limbs toward the sky and announced it would begin by crushing the humans before him. The note called it a sick form of courtesy from none other than the 6th Division's vice commander, Death Bludgeon Matora. The name sent a shiver through the knights. It meant a division commander, a high-ranking demon, and they were not ready. Fujimura stayed calm, sighed and smirked, and muttered that this was happening sooner than he expected. The demon's head turned sharply toward him. Fujimura stood firm, his hand tightening at his side, goosebumps crawling across his skin as a grin spread, and he couldn't wait to see how powerful the demon forces really were. Raising its hand, the being spoke of humans with heavy disdain. Fujimura cursed under his breath. The demon kept mocking their arrogance. Suddenly, it slammed its massive fist into the ground. The impact shattered the ground. Its grotesque face broke into a wide grin. Bludgeoning complete, it announced. The attack was named Matsui, the demonic iron mallet. The knights stared at the cratered ground in horror. Fujimura wiped his brow and muttered that he had barely dodged it. Luckily, he had the transition crystal with him. The demon narrowed its eyes. It recognized transition magic and moved in a blur. Without hesitation, the king ordered the magic corps to prepare another volley and told his knights to assist Frey and his party. The mages launched a second barrage, but when the smoke cleared, it was obvious their attacks had done nothing. The demons stood untouched, mocking their feeble efforts. They scoffed that we could act as if those were worthless against a demon. One of the knights clenched his jaw, powerless. Panic set in. The knights turned to run. The demon reached out a hand. A black circle swirled into existence. Koksu black and blood. It launched the cursed spell at the retreating knights. Dark matter detonated, blood sprayed outward, screams filled the air. Savoring every moment, the demon had missed the freedom and chaos of solo missions, which were a real delight, and anyone who thought they could run now was wrong. Freya stood frozen, her heart pounding. There was no chance against a monster like that, and she had no idea what to do. With a sudden crack, Fujimura appeared behind the demon and swung his wrench hard into the back of the creature's skull. Startled, the demon stumbled as Fujimura glared and barked at it to stop staring. "Your opponent is right here, bastard. A mechanical click sounded as a gun was loaded. Fujimura spoke again, louder this time. This isn't the carnival shooting gallery Frey is used to. This is the big legs, and he is sure she can handle it. Frey steadies herself. Her hands tremble as she raises the gun and aims. A man with animal ears shouted in disbelief. They had no idea what they were doing. Their firepower was hopeless against the demon. The gun had been made for healing and would not help now that they were all going to die. They needed to think about escape, not heroics. Fujimura calmly lit a cigar, then turned and barked at the man. Shut it, sit back, and watch a legend in the making. That girl would become the first female hero in history. The one-armed hero Freya. El Tico suddenly stepped forward, pushed Freya behind her and said she would protect her. Fujimura snapped that El Tico was blocking her shot. The animal-eared man blinked, stunned, the one-armed hero. The demon sneered at the idea that this fragile girl was meant to be the one fated to defeat the demon king and be humanity's last hope. The creature burst into laughter at the irony and then allowed him to propose a wager. If this so-called hero lost, he'd wipe their country off the map as punishment. The king bellowed the word never. The man with animal ears fell to his knees, trembling. It's over. This country is doomed. Fujimura called Freya over and told her to press the button under the weapon's hammer, as Freya confirmed it with a click. Fujimura Grand had gained the weapon's power the last time she used it. Now she only needed to get close enough and release it to send the demon to Kingdom Come. Frey realized as he explained further that the weapon called the Fujimura 10, or Heaven, used a short-range, wide-radius configuration inspired by a megaphone he once made. Built not for pinpoint strikes, but to wipe out an entire area, it was ideal for delivering overwhelming force. Freya smiled confidently. She trusted anything Fujimura had built. Her reaction surprised him. The girl who once doubted her worth as a hero had chosen to believe in him and face a monster others would not face. Fujimura believed that spirit was exactly what made a hero. The demon declared the battle begun and drove its arm down with crushing force. Fujimura stood ready. This was the real test. Freya stepped forward and began her chant, saying dreams, hope, faith. Core power, manufacturing strength. Her shot rang out, and a thunderous explosion tore through the field. Everyone stopped moving as dust filled the air. The demon was half erased, its regeneration failed, and it vanished completely. Fujimura exhaled and reassured her there was nothing to worry about. El Tico clapped and a surprised Freya thanked her. Fujimura chuckled, noting the animal-eared Naginiji seemed taken with her. Naginiji stood silent, processing what had just happened as the truth settled over everyone. For the first time in human history, a B-class adventurer single-handedly defeated a ranked demon. Frau, the one-armed hero. A sharp command rang across the battlefield, assigning roles with precision, and the Imperizer Imperial Heavy Unicorn Knights were ordered to take the center, while Sophia's Fire Magic Squad was stationed at the rear to provide magical support. The Elven Knight Order of the Wind-Blessed Realm of Etonia charged the left flank, while the Great Fang Platoon from the Beast Man Kingdom of Fangawa surged forward on the right. Everything, including status, honor, heritage, glory, and the future, depended on this one battle. Victory seemed within reach as the battle unfolded along Idzuma's demonic front line, where hordes of spider-like monsters lurked. Charging the allied forces, the creatures were struck by something unexpected before they reached the lines. Spider monsters attacked with their antennae, stabbing and whipping their enemies aside. Chaos spread across the battlefield. Amid the chaos, a soldier asked about the delayed reinforcements and whether there was still no word from Salyuan or the Order generals, and the commander replied grimly that they could not afford to fall back, now even if help had not arrived. A bright flash lit the sky, followed by a thunderous roar. Everyone looked up to see who had just landed on the field as the battle raged around them, and two figures appeared overhead. One watched the destruction and said it looked like the first strike had already hit. The other responded, impressed by how many enemies had been taken down. Salyuan, feverish, flinched in surprise at the scale of the attack. His companion removed her helmet and pointed confidently at the huge pile of defeated monsters. That single strike had been hers, taking down twice as many as his. She was the Imperial Order General Leviathan Aquina. Teasing him, she asked if he had any objections. He flinned, clearly enamored with her, smiled slightly and offered no protest. As an SS-class adventurer, he had hopelessly fallen for her. The soldiers' morale soared when they saw you arrive, and they cheered. So the order had been given. Another soldier said the Saluid next to a clienta was famously always at her side. High above the battlefield, a clienta told Heflinth about recent rumors. Curious, he asked about them, and she said word had spread from the red lands of Roraso in the Far East, a small country where something had happened. Elsewhere among the demons, a report reached generally Lord Tel Zero, one of the 6 powerful demon generals. A demon bug brought grim news that Vice Division Commander Madara, out on a scouting mission, was dead. Tell me if Zero was shocked and defeated, and whether it was Soloant or a member of the Order. Elsewhere, 2 people talk about the human world. Someone laughed at the ridiculous claim and said no B-class adventurer could pull that off. Seated on the monster, his companion urged him to go see for himself. The monster recoiled, unnerved by the rumor. Stories say these humans could devour a defeated demon whole in just 2 seconds. Beastman Prince S-ranked venturer Ilyanes said he didn't get along with people who made a business of eating, since eating was his specialty. Smiling confidently, he assured everyone it would be fine. The monster began to move. The youngest novice, known as a prodigy, was prepared to accompany Ilyanes. He ensured his safety with confident, skilled movements. Eileen had no reason to worry, for the noose was no ordinary companion. Still, Eileen recalled another rumor that troubled him even more, a tale of a weapon that could slay a demon in a single strike. Of all the rumors, one unsettled him most. Meanwhile, Fujimura was busy preparing when the king asked about his plans, and whether Fujimura had ever decided how to set his sights on achieving his hero's goal. Their next stop was the Demon King at Zuma's doorstep, and Freya was taken aback that they were heading to the front line so soon. The king braced for the challenge ahead. Even in the best case, the trip from their current location to Idzuma would take at least 6 months by the fastest horse and carriage, and factors like the horse's stamina, weather, wild magical beasts, and rough terrain could easily double that time. Fujimura had another plan. Noting a horse could cover about 50 kilometers a day and that it wasn't a concern, he pulled back a cover. He revealed an unusual sight for this world, his truck nicknamed K-Truck, and explained that the machine, called an automobile, could make the journey in just 2 weeks. Magic stones proved to be a perfect fuel substitute, making travel very convenient. Astounded, the king admired the 2 travelers who kept defying his expectations. He vowed that Roraso would always provide support whenever Fujimura called on it. The others stood in awe before the truck, taking in its unfamiliar, striking design, and Fujimura called to El Tico and Freya. Firmly, he reminded them that reaching the top of the food chain is a long climb, and they needed to get moving. Fujimura handed Freya her prosthetic hand and asked her to try it on. Slipping it on and flexing her fingers, she noticed the mechanism's smooth, lifelike movement and felt it was almost indistinguishable from the real thing. Explained that it was an upgraded version, enabled by another embomagic stone like the Meridian Stone, which greatly increased neural responsiveness, and with smooth movement and dependable performance, it promised seamless operation without electrical issues. Fujimura noted how convenient their current location was. With a little effort, he could craft substitutes for almost anything. Reaching for his cigar box, he found it empty, scanned the table frantically, and then gave up in disappointment. That was the one thing he couldn't replicate. The thought of quitting smoking hit him hard, and he slumped under the weight of the realization. Later, El Tico sat in the back of the K-truck while they traveled. Lee marveled at how far they'd come so quickly, and was amazed by the performance of Fujimura's custom K-truck box. Fujimura stayed sullen, chewing on something while Freya noticed he was biting leather, and he complained that the road looked like it had been laid by someone blindfolded, and that they would not make it through in one piece at that rate, while they also worried their petroleum stones were being used up faster than expected. Freya looked at the map and suggested a detour to Bonus, Goldoro's second-largest city and the world's greatest trade hub, famous for its vast commerce and magic stones from across the continent. It housed a notable figure, the current Minister of Justice, formerly the great sage of Salyuan and regarded as one of the most brilliant minds alive and a veteran of the last great holy war. Back in the truck, Freya figured meeting the minister could help their journey by giving them critical information, possibly even about the Demon King, and Fujimura was intrigued by the mention of such a sharp mind. She joked about paying him a visit and said the minister could bring new cigars, while Freya questioned his sudden change of heart and reminded him that he had quit smoking earlier. Re-energized, Fujimura said he felt renewed, and Freya teased him for losing his resolve so quickly. Suddenly, he spotted something up ahead. A person collapsed by the roadside. They drew closer and found a woman, half human and half beast, unconscious, bruised, and chained. He pulled the truck over and stepped out to investigate. Freya followed and asked what was wrong. Fujimura stepped up to the girl, who stirred slightly, dazed and frightened. She kept apologizing. Her stomach growled with hunger. Kamlai, Fujimura accessed his spatial storage and he offered her some bread, saying she needed to eat and calm herself before anything else. Fujimura gave a piece of bread to the starving woman. who immediately began salivating before. Devouring it urgently, he prompted Freya to provide healing, and she obliged. As Frey's healing magic took hold, the woman looked shocked, and Fujimura turned to her chains and used an angle grinder, an industrial tool for high-speed polishing, grinding, and cutting to cut them free. The chains snapped cleanly. Watching her eat in desperation, he realized how hungry she must have been and reassured her that no one would take the food and she could eat at her own pace. She looked at him with wide eyes, overwhelmed by his kindness, and began to sob loudly. Tears streamed freely down her face. Freya studied the woman's features and concluded she was a beastman who had likely traveled far to escape captivity. Freya pointed out a mark on the woman's shoulder. It was identified as a slave's brand when Fujimura asked. Freya said that in the darkest parts of society, children who are orphaned, kidnapped, or forced into marriages are often sold into slavery and made to do cruel labor while being treated as objects. Beastmen were often treated the worst of all, she noted. Suddenly, the sound of hooves drew near. 3 horsemen rode in, and one spotted the woman, annoyed at having to chase her and speaking condescendingly while criticizing her for escaping on her own. He said she couldn't escape them while they had a special stone, because the chains and the stone were linked, and its signal let them track her. She recoiled in terror when he announced it was time for her punishment. As a rare white wolf beastman, she was highly valued in criminal markets for experimentation, organ harvesting, forced servitude, and sexual exploitation. She would now be used as a breeder for them, boasting that her ability to transform into a beast had already been sealed. Fujimura patted her head gently to calm her. He reassured her she had done well surviving this long on her own, and that from here on he would handle the rest. She stopped crying, moved by his words. Freya watched the moment with a smile as Altico suddenly stepped forward. Burning with fury, she fixed her gaze on the man. Startled, Fujimura told Altico to stop, afraid she might hurt him in her anger. One man mocked them, brushing it off and loudly commenting on Altico's looks. The others laughed and suggested taking her for themselves, but before any of them could act, Altico slammed her foot down. Everything moved in a blur. Moved in front of the first man and landed a swift, brutal kick to his face. He knocked him to the ground, and the other 2 stood stunned. Freya froze, unable to grasp how Altico closed the distance so quickly, stunned by the sheer speed of the attack. One of the remaining men angrily demanded to know who she was and tried to counterattack, swinging his sword at her. Altico raised her arm calmly and let the blade strike the armored plating. The sword scraped uselessly against her armor, and the man was stunned to find it unyielding. Altico didn't hesitate and punched him so hard he was sent flying, and Fujimura, impressed, praised her new equipment and called her Najiniji. Altico confirmed with satisfaction that she was definitely enjoying it. Spotting a piece of equipment, Freya asked Fujimura about it. Fujimura explained they might eventually have to deal with human enemies, so capturing them alive would be more useful. Freya's firearm hit hard, but the new equipment he had crafted was meant for a different kind of engagement. Altico, who Fujimura also called Naginji, had very little mana, but the gear could gather and channel even faint mana to temporarily boost her physical strength. Freya considered what the manor's accumulation mechanism would mean. Fujimura added that even without help, Altico was already a force of nature, an A-rank powerhouse with the brute strength of a gorilla. Her mana output was relatively weak, so the boost would be short, but used effectively it could push her into a higher class, possibly even S-rank. The equipment's output could be easily adjusted to match her natural strength, he said, making it ideal for neutralizing vulnerable human targets. He called the equipment Shippo. When the last of the slavers tried to escape El Tico, he collided with another figure, fell to the ground, and looked up. The man was shocked to see Vito Rai standing in his way. Vito, unfazed, muttered the fight looked tough, but admitted he would have to pull his weight somehow. The fallen man laughed triumphantly and told Fujimura this was the end for them, explaining that Vito Rai was no ordinary opponent, a former knight of the Holy Imperial Order of Empirizer, and one of the world's strongest who had returned to the front lines as vice-captain of the Imperial Knights. He also held a senior position in their organization, but Vito suddenly hit him on the head and dismissed his claims. He insisted he was now just a wanted man, a fugitive hunted by the whole nation. The only place left for someone like him was the shadows of society. Stunned by the revelation, Freya asked if he had really been a holy knight, and Fujimura then asked about his strength. Freya explained that knights were elite warriors, trained from childhood under strict discipline, loyal to their nations, and trained in advanced combat strategies, and that even the lowest among them were said to have the strength of a B-rank fighter, making their expertise critical to the human war against the demon race. This was no ordinary knight. A former vice-captain of the Empirizer stood before her, a title so formidable she could not begin to gauge his true power. Vito stretched his arm casually, noticing it had been a while and that a little effort wouldn't hurt. Life felt flat to him no matter where he ended up. Seeing Freya as the greatest threat, he targeted the healer. Moving fast and with clear intent, he lunged at her. But just as he closed the gap, El Tico's powerful kick hit him, knocking him down. Startled, he looked up at her and admitted it had been a dangerously close call. Fujimura was stunned by the sheer force and speed of El Tico's intervention. Vito, arrogant though he was, quickly weighed his options. Renowned for sensing danger, survival was his chief skill, knowing exactly when to run without hesitation if things went wrong. His top skill was plain self-preservation. Vito scratched his head as he weighed his options. The balance of advantages and disadvantages kept shifting quickly in his mind. Realizing it might be time to retreat, he decided first to assess his opponent's combat abilities, and though reluctant, reached for a powerful and precious A-class magic stone. The analysis stone could visually reveal a target's strength, show their latent potential, and identify the type of any cursed seals they carried, so he directed it at El Tico first. The magic activated, and a vision appeared before him. A blade hovered close to him. There was much more. Vito studied her aura and combat essence in their Rost form, and she was far from the top of her rank, already with one foot in the S-class tier and tremendous potential for further growth, leaving him awestruck and exasperated. This would be one hell of a job, worth a substantial bonus. He turned his gaze to Freya next. Freya tensed the moment his eyes met hers. The analysis started again, and the vision began. First there was darkness, then a faint light appeared in the distance. Looking up, he saw a glowing ring of light with something deeply sinister hidden behind it. The air shifted, he froze, alarmed. Violence radiated from her in a way he could not understand. It was more than an intense presence. It overwhelmed him, as if an entire army had been condensed into one person. He had assumed the elf would be the strongest, and that assumption was shattered. Vito then turned his attention to Fujimura. Casually, Fujimura asked if something was wrong. Unsettled and wondering if he'd lost his nerve, Vito shifted his gaze and tried to gauge the seemingly average man. An impossibly carefree young tinkerer might be hiding something. Suddenly, Vito's vision filled with a nightmarish scene. Chains shot into view, wrapping tightly around him and clinging to every inch of his body. The grass under his feet became a dark, reflective liquid. He was being pulled under. Panic seized him. His breath failed, and he had to reach the surface immediately or risk drowning in the depths of this vision. His eyes widened with terror as a monstrous entity rose, working the chains and opening its cavernous mouth. Pure dread overwhelmed him. The vision abruptly shattered when the analysis stone cracked and disintegrated in his hand, ending the magical projection. Vito collapsed to his knees. He clutches his head, trembles, and gasps for air. Fujimura looked at him with puzzled curiosity, noting his heavy breathing and clear distress, asked if something had leaked and offered a napkin in jest, but Vito gritted his teeth, still trembling from the memory the analysis had triggered, that same suffocating presence. The reason he'd once fled the front lines and the disgrace he'd suffered had returned. Back then, he'd used the analysis stone on a demon and seen its true form. That fear never left him. A seemingly ordinary man stood before him, but Vito felt that same crushing aura again. Every instinct told him to run. Fujimura stood still, waiting for the video's next move. Vito let out a long breath, admitted defeat, knew when to back down, and gave a faint smile as he thought quietly. If it had been only the elf, he might have had a chance, but the two monstrous anomalies, Freya and Fujimura, tilted the scales so far he had no hope of winning. All his cards were gone. Fujimura was not inclined to forgive. Standing firm, Fujimura said there would be no leniency. Vito blinked, taken aback. He refused to treat things the same after Vito nearly killed Freya. Freya tried to ease the tension, and Vito also tried to play it down. Claiming no real harm had been done, and that the odds had been stacked against him from the start, Fujimura wasn't convinced and stepped forward, wrench in hand, warning Vito to be quiet and stay still. Nervous, Vito tried to reason with him, while silently wondering what was wrong with this kid, but nothing he said seemed to get through as he gritted his teeth. Vito suddenly offered to share some valuable information for free, and it wasn't just for Fujimura, but also for his little friend. That got Fujimura's attention, and he glanced at the wolf girl. She met his gaze with innocent curiosity. In Fujimura's mind, she was no more threatening than a tiny, lovable puppy. He turned back to Vito and said if he wanted mercy, he would need the pipsqueak's approval, and Vito flinched at being ordered to grovel to a former slave. Yet he forced himself to face the girl, apologized, begged for forgiveness, and promised to change. Fujimura said coldly that the penalty was death. Vito went pale. Panicked, he offered his help, saying there were many ways he could assist them. Freya spoke up and urged them to at least hear him out, wanting to know what this information about her was. Fujimura, still glaring, relented. Vito relaxed slightly, acknowledged the successful negotiation and said they would listen, then pointed at Altico. Vito said Altico was cursed. Freya was taken aback, as Vito said elves are naturally gifted in magic, yet he felt almost no mana from her. A curse called Magu, the mana eater, caused it. This ancient control magic was built to drain mana from its source. It was a powerful, forbidden curse operating on a level far beyond the beast woman's curse. He said he had no idea how El Tico could use a person at all. That she could produce any magic, even briefly, was a miracle. Freya, alarmed, asked what could be done about it. Vito said grimly that this kind of control magic usually required either the caster's death or an equally strong release spell to undo it, and a Magu curse was even more dangerous because killing the caster would not stop it, and the only way to break it completely was to destroy the host who carried the curse. Freya struggled to absorb the weight of Vito's revelation, and he quietly told himself that if anyone had really managed to cast a Magu curse on an elf, then El Tico had to be a monster herself. Only someone at the very top of Zafat could have placed such a powerful curse, most likely Meletic, the dark magician known as the ultimate bringer of misfortune. Freya remembered the names. A massive crime syndicate, they were known for slave trading and were said to have tens of thousands of members. Their main base of operations was in Bonus. Vito confirmed the detail, and Fujimura raised an eyebrow, wondering if he was worried about revealing so much. Vito brushed it off. Vito felt no special loyalty to Zafat. His own survival came first. With his job finished, he was ready to head back, adding casually that they should come up with a decent excuse for the higher-ups when they returned, just in case. And as Vito prepared to leave, Fujimura stopped him with a wrench and insisted he give them a lift because they had business in Bonus 2. Fujimura even suggested Vito take them straight to the center of the syndicate's hideout. Vito was baffled. Fujimura had ignored every warning. The place was crawling with scum. Vito doubted Fujimura was serious. If Safet realized he was betraying them, Safet would be dead. Fujimura looked back at El Tico and the wolf girl. He promised them he would break the curse soon. Both girls looked moved. The wolf girl hugged him warmly and called him Fuji. Fujimura laughed and called her a happy bunny, teasing her about her size with his usual pipsqueak. She called him Fuji again, more warmly this time. Fujimura's tone darkened. No suffering could match what those girls had been through, and he was determined to tear Zafat apart piece by piece. Vito panicked and asked him to calm down. Fujimura was furious and vowed never to forgive child abduction. Moments later, the K-truck engine started. Fujimura ordered Vito to get in. He cursed under his breath, not understanding why he had to go along. Even with his powerful new allies, the situation still felt wrong to him. Fujimura repeated the order firmly and without room for negotiation. In the truck, Vito muttered that he felt like he was the one being kidnapped. Fujimura shot back that criminals don't get to choose. At last, they reached the Bonus, Goldaro's second great city. Crowds filled the city. The city overflowed with exotic stones and trade, and Freya was overwhelmed by its size and variety as the streets came alive with beer halls and bustling crowds. Fujimura announced that check-in was complete. He praised Ganchan, saying that even though he was king of a small country, he was still a king, and had been generous enough to lend them a large sum so they would live comfortably for a while. The break didn't last long. A gang of rough-looking men spotted them, and one called out that some easy targets had just rolled in. Someone else mocked Fujimura's openly displayed gold, called him careless, and said they'd take it as payment for being so naive. Vito groaned inwardly, trying to keep a low profile and avoid this exact kind of attention. One of the thugs recognized Vito and greeted him, surprised to see him out in public. Slapping Fujimura on the back, he called them Vito's new slaves, mocked Fujimura's tacky look, figured he was a clueless noble from a backwater kingdom, and asked how much Vito planned to sell him for. The conversation then turned to Vito's supposed rise, and the men teased him about joining. Suddenly, one of them was hit in the head with a wrench. He collapsed immediately. Fujimura stood over him and said that if they were looking for work, they should look elsewhere. The organization they were so excited about would soon be nothing but ruins. 50 years had passed since her daughter vanished without warning, and in that time her husband had grown frail and could barely walk. Once their daughter had been a gentle, reliable presence at home, always helping with chores and looking after the younger children. She had been the light of their lives and their treasure. Decades later, the mother still remembered her daughter's voice and innocent smile as if it were yesterday, and although her daughter would be 56 now if she had survived, the mother kept all her clothes, unable to throw any away and carrying the long regret of not staying closer and failing to protect her. The old woman's story, which Fujimura had heard earlier that day, stayed with him, and stories like that made him want to punch the people who caused such pain, because she had insisted that before her time ran out, she wanted at least one chance to see her daughter again. He went to apologize for failing to protect her. She was already 80, and her tears and trembling voice stayed with him. Fujimura saw himself as a simple craftsman, an old man with no real power or way to help, but he clenched his hand tighter. He thought there might be something he could do. That night back in Bonus, empty dinner plates sat before them as Freya and Vito watched Fujimura in silence. They were clearly in high spirits as the town overflowed with good food, alcohol, and lively activity, exactly the kind of place you like. He said he planned to get serious tomorrow, go to the markets for new gear, and maybe visit someone called the Great Sage. Vito flinched. The Great Sage was effectively the head of the judiciary, not on their side. Fujimura seemed unconcerned and decided to call it a night and get ready for an early start tomorrow. Vito was already planning his exit, wanting to leave before anything unpredictable happened, but Fujimura wasn't letting him off the hook, clapping a heavy hand on his shoulder and saying they were heading to another bar because the night was still young. Vito said he needed sleep and got cranky without 12 hours of rest, but Fujimura grinned, tightened his grip, and insisted he'd handle everything, so Vito gave in and agreed. Walking to the door, Fujimura cheerfully told the others not to worry and promised they wouldn't overdo it. Behind them, the wolf girl began to cry and called out for Fujimura. Freya held her gently and watched them go, Fujimura smiling brightly as he led the way into the night. Later, walking through the city, Vito asked where they were going and joked they should stop by his sister's workplace. Fujimura had something else in mind, videos about the hideout. Vito was stunned, unable to believe Fujimura was serious, and even more surprised that Fujimura planned to go in alone. Fujimura said the plan came entirely from his own motives, and he didn't want anyone else to get caught up in something that came from his selfish desire. Vito sighed. If he stayed around this lunatic any longer, it wouldn't matter how many lives he had, he'd lose them all. Watching Fujimura's determined back, an idea came to him. Vito suddenly bolted, telling Fujimura to die on his own time. In a flash, Fujimura used his ring and appeared in front of Vito, leaving him stunned and barely able to react. Before Fujimura slammed his wrench into the ground, he shattered the stone beneath and made the earth rumble. Vito felt shaken. Fujimura admitted he might have been wrong and that he was the one asking for a favor. Vito had no choice but to help. Vito's mind scrambled. It looked like a spatial transition technique he'd thought existed only in fairy tales. Fujimura's physical enhancement was unreal, and the kid's identity remained a mystery. Fujimura asked again whether he should crack open Vito's head as a melonous penance for all his past sins. Overwhelmed, Vito surrendered. They finally reached their destination. Vito announced they had arrived. A huge fish-like creature thrashed in the water in front of them. Amazed, Fujimura took in the scale of it all. Vito said this was the real reason Zafat, the colossal crime syndicate, had never been brought down. At the heart of the bonus lay a hidden dungeon. The waterfall labyrinth was also called the aquarium. The syndicate's headquarters sat right at its center. On the 15th level, deep enough that any slave who tried to escape wouldn't stand a chance, Vito stepped forward, pressed a hidden stone, and opened a secret passage reserved for the organization's top executives. Fujimura doubted the sudden shift in attitude and suspected Vito's motives. Vito brushed it off as a late-night mood, but privately he saw it as an opportunity. If he could manipulate Fujimura and use his strength to subdue some high-level monsters, the rest of the syndicate might be forced to acknowledge him as their true leader, and a smirk crossed his face as they descended the staircase. He weighed backup plans. If things went wrong, he could always slip into another criminal underworld. They soon reached a large metal door. It was the last gate between them and the hideout's core. Vito pressed his hand into the embedded magic circle. The gate was built from steel as thick as a warrior's arm and sealed with a magic stone that repelled all forms of magic. It could only be opened by applying a specific Manny signature. When he tried to activate it, he froze. Cursing, he slammed his fist against the gate. His signature had been deleted. They learned of his betrayal faster than expected. Sighing, Vito slid down the wall, defeated, and told Fujimura they had reached a dead end, that no one could open the gate without a magic key, and that now he had revealed himself, someone would be on their tail. Fujimura approached the gate, inspected it with a craftsman's eye, and estimated it was about 1,000 millimeters thick. He said nothing, reached into his spatial storage, and pulled out a bundle of equipment. He told Vito to step aside. Vito watched, confused. As Fujimura laid out a collection of strange tools, he announced he would open the gate. Vito laughed, frustrated that Fujimura wasn't listening. Without the correct man of signature, there was no way to bypass the magical steel. Fujimura calmly pulled on gloves and said confidently that steel was just steel. He said he would show Vito something he called modern magic. From his coat, he pulled what looked like a metal torch and ignited it. Adjusting the flame, he began to explain. This cutting torch had regulators, fuel gas valves, oxygen, acetylene, and several precise controls. By combining oxygen and acetylene, the torch was designed to cut through thick steel precisely. First, the metal was heated to about 800 to 900 degrees, just until it glowed orange. Vito opened the disconnection valve, and a high-temperature jet blasted through the metal as he stood stunned, watching the blue flame cut into the gate. Fujimura moved the torch steadily, keeping the same speed and height while watching for small changes in the steel of a gate section once thought impenetrable. It was cut cleanly and fell with a thud to the ground. Fujimura turned off the torch. A massive enchanted steel door, meant to be unbreakable by magic now, had a rectangular hole cut straight through it. He pointed out the tool had limits, struggling with metals like aluminum or stainless steel, but it was cheap, reliable, and didn't need electricity, and if they ran into something tougher, he'd switch to plasma cutting, leaving Vito with his jaw hanging open. Nothing made sense to Vito. Fujimura spoke in terms he had never heard, mentioned welding devices Vito did not understand, and did things that looked like magic without any magic, so Vito demanded to know what Fujimura really was, and Fujimura just grinned and told him to stop fussing. He was just a humble craftsman. In the stillness of night, noticing Fujimura still had not returned, she remembered his earlier comment that it was the perfect time for adults to have fun. Even so, it was worrying that he was still out so late. She walked to the window and saw the young wolf girl, Pip, pacing outside. "I'm surprised to see her at this hour." Freya questioned whether she should be there. Pip replied with cheerful determination and said she was heading out to find Fujimura. Freya hesitated. The city was vast, and finding someone there would be difficult. She remembered that Pip, as a beastman, had a sense of smell far superior to humans, probably 100 times more sensitive, and still recalled Fujimura calling it adult time. Freya decided it was too dangerous for Pip to go alone and volunteered to accompany her, when El Tico suddenly spoke up and insisted she would join them as well, leaving Freya surprised to find El Tico there. Meanwhile, deep within the hideout, Fujimura and Vito watched the bustling scene below. Organization members are drinking and celebrating. Vito said this was a meeting spot where they waited for orders, and that 100 men stood ready to guard it around the clock. Fujimura decided they should slip away before anyone noticed, noting the secret route had proved very useful. With a sly grin, Vito agreed, but they were interrupted before they could continue. A large seal-like creature blocked their path. Hemashil, the beast that patrolled the labyrinth's back passages, weighed over a ton and was no ordinary monster, and Vito warned Fujimura that the creature was one of Aquaria's most dangerous. But before Vito finished, Fujimura had already struck the monster's head with his wrench. Rendering it unconscious, he pressed on without pause as Vito watched, impressed. They were not surprised by Fujimura's decisive move. As they moved on, Vito told Fujimura the next chamber was the slave room, a detention center mainly for women and children. They entered to find a bleak scene, the prisoners looking miserable and defeated. Fujimura narrowed his eyes when he saw the slave brand on the girl's shoulder. The full weight of the moment settled on him. Vito pinched his nose in disgust, complained about the stench, mocked their lack of hygiene, and dismissed it as unimportant since they were meant to be sold. Then Fujimura stepped forward and declared he was breaking in, catching Vito off guard. Fujimura vowed to free every last one of them and reached into his gear to pull out a reciprocating saw. An electric tool that moves its blade back and forth quickly, ideal for cutting a range of materials. It had interchangeable blades and produced no sparks, so it was suitable for this confined space. He tossed a hacksaw to Vito, a compact manual tool for cutting metal that works in tight quarters, and told him to help. Vito stared at the tool, struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. Outside, Freya, Pip, and El Tico reached what looked like the hideout's entrance. Pip paused and sniffed the air around the rocky terrain. Freya asked if Pip sensed anything and wondered if a device might be hidden in the rock face. As they considered their next move, a voice spoke from behind them, questioning why the two young women were there so late, implying suspicion. Freya laughed nervously to calm the situation, saying they were just out looking for someone. Descending smoothly from his perch, the man landed beside them, studied them closely, and pressed his hand against a stone. A mechanical click echoed from the rocks, and standing at the rocky entrance, he decided the group had stumbled on a hidden store, introduced himself as a clerk, and offered to lead them around. Surprised, Freya realized there was an entrance hidden in the stone. The man urged them to stay close because the place's hidden layout was strange and winding, and it was easy to get lost. He also hinted they would likely enjoy what lay ahead, and deep in the hideout Fujimura had freed the slaves. When the final cell opened, the rescued women began thanking their rescuers. Several thanked Vito directly, and one thanked Fujimura. After that, Vito turned their attention to the next target, Maldik, the boss at the top of the chain. He pointed to a corridor and said the route began there. The path went straight ahead. Keep following the passage to the right, and it will lead straight to him. Instead of charging ahead immediately, Fujimura handed Vito a bag of coins. Vito frowned, asked what the gesture meant, then felt the weight and understood the gold's value. Fujimura smiled and offered the money as thanks for all Vito had done so far. He made it clear this was a farewell gift. It was small, but maybe enough for Vito to start over far from all of it. Fujimura urged him to take the freed captives and leave the city. Now was the time for Vito to give up the life of a villain. When Fujimura turned and waved, Vito stood silent, feeling the weight of the moment. Vito's words showed Fujimura intended to face Maldik, though Fujimura admitted he might not win. For him, backing down now would bring worse regret than losing. His conviction was clear. Vito's expression changed. Vito pressed his lips together. Then came one final piece of advice. Fujimura had to watch out for one more person, someone as deranged and formidable as Maldik, and if he faced both of them at once, he should turn back immediately. Bastilla was the man's name, a beastman of terrifying strength. He had annihilated an entire night squad sent to capture him, and was without question a true S-rank threat. Elsewhere, Freya, Pip, and El Tico followed the clerk through the entrance, and he warned them to be careful because the area ahead was slick and dangerous. From a distance, a figure reclined on a grand seat, watching Fujimura and Vito and muttering impatiently, eager for Fujimura's arrival. Grinning with eager anticipation. By then, Vito and the rescued slaves had made it out of the hideout. One by one, he handed each slave a gold coin. He pressed it into their palms. With their chains broken, their futures were now their own. What they did next and where they went from here would be their decision. One of the girls asked where Vito was going. Vito said he was going straight back in. His goal hadn't changed. His ambition remained to become the head of the organization. To do that, he needed to know what was happening inside right now. As he descended the stairs again, doubt clouded his thoughts, returned to seize control. With his betrayal exposed, those hopes were pointless, and his chance was already gone. The image of Fujimura stayed in his mind. That lunatic charged in alone, driven by that maddening idealism. It was better to fail together than to stand alone and lose everything. If Fujimura truly believed in his naive ideals, Vito would see how far that foolishness could take him. Elsewhere in the hideout, Fujimura stood before an enormous ominous door, adorned with a skull, and stared up at it, thinking how far his stubbornness had brought him. Not wrong yet. This had to be the gate to Maldik, the man at the top. It was massive and probably secured by a human-operated mechanism. Before he could take another step, the door creaked open on its own. Darkness filled the room, and every minute felt heavy. Inside sat the man himself, Maldik. A skeleton behind his high-backed chair made a hollow rattle. Maldik welcomed Fujimura and said this was the very peak of Zafat's underworld. Fujimura recognized him immediately, the man pulling the strings behind this filth-ridden den. He clenched his fists and decided no more talk. He had come to put Maldik down, but Maldik laughed, confident the lone upstart stood no chance, though he admitted some curiosity. They wanted to know who Fujimura really was, so he recounted what he knew about Fujimura using transition magic and cutting through the impenetrable gate with strange but effective techniques, feats unlike anything anyone had seen and enough to truly pique his interest. Fujimura froze as Maldik explained the city and dungeon were rigged with scattered magic stones that gave him eyes everywhere, so he had been watching closely because Fujimura's every move had been strange. Just when things turned strange and unpredictable, Maldik produced a magical projection of three familiar figures, Freya, Pip, and El Tico, all being led by Bastia. He admitted he had at first only been watching the former knight Vittori, who betrayed him, but in the process he stumbled on something much more interesting. Fujimura's expression hardened when he saw the girls, and he wondered why they were here. A mimetic chuckle escaped him. One of them, even after escaping, had foolishly come back to him, his magical energies focused on El Tico's face. Maldik continued, noting that one of the three was a Mago elf born in this very place, and that Fujimura must have been curious too about that little guinea pig slave of his. The words guinea pig slave hit Fujimura like a blow, and Maletic called El Tico a miraculous success, an accidental but extraordinary creation from elsewhere. Bastilla led Freya, Pip, and El Tico through a door and announced it was the legendary diner. Inside it was pitch dark. A dry, sharp clatter cut the silence. A skull rolled across the floor. Its empty sockets glared up at them. The sound froze rang out, and lights suddenly filled the chamber. They faced a grotesque setup. Skulls lined a long table, a spiked chair and a thorny necklace lay among other implements, and countless skeletal remains filled the room. The door slammed shut behind them. Freya turned sharply toward Bastia. Smugly, he showed them what he called his pride, his torture chamber. Freya stared in disbelief. Bastia scolded them for trusting people too much. Turning to Pip, he commented on her return to this hellish place. Bastia held up a skeleton and taunted her, saying these were the remains of those who helped her escape and sneering that she should not expect them to be upset about her capture. It did not matter because he had already stripped them to the bone, noting that one in particular had tasted awful. Pip was overwhelmed by the memory of a kind beast man who had once promised to rescue her. He had a child her age and vowed to get her out. Tears filled her eyes as Bastia broke into wild laughter. Suddenly, El Tico's foot struck his face, cutting him off. Cold fury burned in her eyes. Bastia staggered and cried out in pain. Hit by a savage punch while snarling a slur at her, El Tico slammed into the wall. Eyes widened in horror at the blood. Tears ran down El Tico's face, while Fujimura watched it all on a magical screen. Still seated, Maletic mocked the scene, noting Fujimura's allies were clearly in trouble, and that an A-ranker like El Tico stood no chance against an S-ranker like Bastilla, but Fujimura then spoke up and asked Maletic a question. Milder admitted she had been considerably stronger before using the Magu on El Tico. They aimed to turn the elves' innate power into the perfect weapon. She had been dangerous even before she was born. As a precaution, he had cursed her the moment she was born. Fujimura thanked him for the answer. Maldek looked confused. Fujimura clarified that in that case he would shatter the cursed vessel and restore El Tico's original power. Maldek raised an eyebrow, so Fujimura already knew how to release the Magu, but it was unclear whether he could actually do it. Maldek challenged him by presenting a steel box that contained the Magu. Nobody had ever broken it. It was made from an indestructible magical stone. Fujimura stared at the box. The box felt strangely familiar. He remembered being shown a rare piece made by Yamada Seisaka Shu. While they talked, tiny letters appeared, and the engravings in the pedestal were only 0.03 of a millimeter thick. About 1/130th the thickness of a sheet of paper. Its surface was flawless. That level of precision was impossible with machines alone. It had to be handcrafted. Fujimura was certain that this kind of engineering did not come from this world. The box had to be a relic from his own world, his Earth. Still, the question remained how something so precisely made had ended up in this strange place. Fujimura demanded to know where Maldit had acquired the impossibly refined, mysterious box. Meltik said casually that it was a family heirloom from his predecessor, likely forged in Idzuma. Some even claimed it dated back to ancient times. As he spoke, the skull-shaped monster's magical eye glowed and pulsed with energy. When the creature lunged at Fujimura, he calmly, without hesitation, obliterated it with a single strike. The skull beast froze, stunned by how quickly it fell. Maldek watched with fascination, quietly admiring the precision and power of Fujimura's strike. Fujimura said he would finish things quickly and had no time for games. He lunged at Maldek in a blink, but a sudden impact shoved him back. A translucent shield surrounded Maldek's body, stopping the attack. A message that can inform him that the barrier completely blocked physical strikes. Fujimura stepped back to reassess, surprised to find that such technology or magic existed in this world. Maldek, calling himself a dark mage, said physical defenses were standard for magic users. His calculations showed Fujimura's physical enhancements matched a 6th grade technique, making him about a B-rank warrior. Fujimura was strong but ultimately a physical specialist with no magical edge. Melder acknowledged Fujimura's transition ability was an unexpected problem. It was nothing he couldn't handle in the end. Suddenly, sharp objects began to protrude from the walls. They turned out to be a swarm of needle-nosed fish-like monsters. They dived down. Meldick presented a challenge. Meldick wanted to see if Fujimura could avoid them all. Fujimura tensed and his eyes lit with supernatural awareness. When the monstrous swarm fell like a rain of spikes, he moved with fluid, flawless precision. Every attack missed as he dodged each one. All the monsters lay embedded in the floor, while Fujimura remained untouched. Meldick was speechless, stunned by the feat. Fujimura coldly said such weak enemies weren't even worth using his transition ability on. The fish-like creatures collapsed into ruins. Vito stood in the hallway and secretly watched through the door. It became clear that Fujimura had avoided every strike. At that moment, Vito started to believe Fujimura could actually beat Maldives. Maletic, still wide-eyed, muttered in amazement, noting the precision, the control, and the raw talent at so young an age, while his seeker instincts ignited and he wondered where Fujimura had grown up and what bloodline he came from, making him want to tear Fujimura apart and analyze everything about him. Nothing since Altico had intrigued him so much. Fujimura repeated the words guinea pig and asked what Altico actually was. He mailed it and admitted it. LTCO was an elf-demon hybrid, a creature both forbidden and unnatural. Vito watched on, visibly shaken. Fujimura stared at Meldick in silence. On the screen, Pip and Freya were supporting Altico. Blood streaked her face. Meldick added that it was a grotesque fusion, a union born of the deepest taboo. Freya drew her gun and fired, not at the enemy, but to heal Altico. With her wounds closed, Altico took up her stance and was ready to fight again. Freya exhaled, thinking fast. Firing offensive shots was too risky in such tight quarters. She could only keep healing. Bastia groaned, annoyed that healing her was so difficult. Altico was tougher than she looked, and the fight would take time. He grumbled that he'd hoped to toy with her longer. Maletic laughed through the magical connection, mocking Bistia for struggling with what he called a couple of measly slaves. Bistia snapped back angrily, insisting he had things under control. Bastia turned back to Altico and told her to stop hesitating and use the secret weapon she had been holding back, confident it would be worth it. Estia decided to deal with the troublesome weapon first and seized Freya's gun. Both Freya and Altico froze in place. Inspecting the firearm, he checked it. Leering at Freya, Bastilla licked her face, revealing a disturbing fixation on human women, and said she would be saved for last, a palate cleanser after the others. Altico stepped in to intervene. Bistia reacted instantly, hitting her with brutal force. She flew backward and crashed into the wall. Blood spurted from her mouth as she collapsed. Freya rushed to her side as she coughed. Bastia loomed over them and mocked Altico. They demanded to know what her life had been like after she escaped the facility. Altico, trembling and bloodied, tried to speak, but more blood spilled from her lips. Bistia sneered at her black, monostripped hair, a clear sign of elven heresy. He guessed life outside had been no better than what she endured inside these walls. A flash of rage she once had came back to him, and he now realized it came from that same shame and suffering. From afar, Vito watched it all unfold on the surveillance screen. Thoughts raced through his head as he wondered why they were still there, and could not see how hopeless it was, since they had no chance against Bastilla, and Altico tried to rise. Another violent kick from Bistia slammed her back down. Bistia barked, demanding to know who had given her permission to move. For flinching. Bistia kept ranting that slaves had no human rights. No matter how far she ran, Altico was still just their tool. Frey clenched his teeth in helpless anger and Bastilla added that although Altico's mother, a former researcher, had once escaped them, the daughter would not be so lucky. He vowed to grind Altico's bones to dust by the end of the day. Pain intensified, and Altico's mind drifted back to old, fragmented memories and a faint, warm presence. A young woman spoke in a gentle voice as her mother apologized softly while handing the infant Altico. Has been called Lafral, a small stone humming with mana that she had saved for this day. It was a single-use transition stone. The device could teleport one person. If Lafral used it, it would send her straight to the elven village, a sanctuary beyond the reach of their captors. In the fading memories, baby Lafral chuckled while holding the woman's finger. A child called for her mama, and the woman's eyes filled with tears. She held her baby close and whispered a final plea to live on for both of them, believing that as long as Lafral survived, she would one day find happiness and smile again. The tender moment ended suddenly when enemies closed in and shouts rang out. Resolute threw her child to safety, knowing Lafal's path would be harsh and that the curse and endless trials would weigh on her. She believed someone would one day care for her daughter. Love her, give her a reason to smile. That parting wish stayed in Altico's heart. Back in the present, Altico rose again, battered and bleeding but unyielding. Moving forward, she put herself in front of Freya, shielding her. Shaped by a life of rejection, contempt, and exploitation, Altico had never known kindness or luck, and none of it mattered to her anymore. Altico stood firm while Freya, overcome with emotion, cried and begged her to stop, and Altico said her only reason for living was to protect Freya. She refused to back down. Vito, watching from a distance, fell silent, his eyes widening as he took in her resolve. Elsewhere, seated with smug detachment, Maledic sneered watched with disdain. He loathed emotional speeches and righteous resolve. That fiery, sentimental resolve soured his mood. He activated his magic and conjured a small sphere. He ordered his men to gather at the diner and promised them a feast, a cruel preview of the violence to come. Soldiers laughed among themselves. Maledic was finally letting them loose on the intruders he had named. They took malicious pleasure that women were involved, jeering and eager to pounce, first come, first served. Visca tried to rule again in male, insisting he had things under control since he had even transformed, but Maledic dismissed the claim and addressed his men again. He told them it was meant to give anyone still resisting a taste of despair, and remind them how cruelly unbeatable reality could be. Vito dismissed their refusal to surrender as empty defiance. Inescapable crushing defeat awaited any fool who dared to hope. Vito clenched his teeth in anger. Vito grudgingly admitted to himself that Maledic's words were true. Those who refused to face the truth were deluded fools, but something inside him stirred, and he sprang into action. Bolting into the tunnel, he raced to the gathering point where Maledic's men had assembled. The group was already grumbling with anticipation, wondering why so much effort was being made over just 4 intruders. One brushed it off but still looked forward to enjoying it. Vito arrived. He planted himself in front of them. One of the men mocked him as soon as he saw him, and the others taunted Vito Rai as a coward, sure he hadn't come to stop them. They laughed harder, scoffing at the idea that a sniveling coward like Vito could be a hero and remembering how he had once been a knight who ran from battle and abandoned his comrades. Yet Vito stood his ground, admitted it himself, and was as shocked as anyone by what he was doing. Memories of El Tico and Fujimura filled his mind. The disgraced, pathetic former knight had returned, not to flee, but to face the monsters he had once run from. He had come to stop them. This was Kolo, a small eastern nation, where Vito was born as the eldest son of a noble house. A prominent figure arrived in a grand carriage on a bright day, and the people of the country gathered in admiration. Whispers moved through the crowd, marveling at the towering beast beside the man and recognizing him as the commander of the Still Knights, Colossus Guardian. Women swooned as he walked by. From an upstairs window, 10-year-old Vito watched with bright eyes, barely able to contain his excitement. Vito slid down a rope to greet the man face to face. A towering figure caught him in midair and hoisted the boy onto his shoulders. Vito's father stood nearby. Beaming with pride, he teased his son as the crowd laughed. The boy did not fully understand then, but to him his father was everything. The strongest knight in the land, the pride of their territory. Vito's sole aim in life was to become like him, a man worthy to stand at his side. One day Vito overheard soldiers talking about heading to the northern forest where rumors said demons lived, and that was the day everything changed. It happened without warning. His father returned battered and broken, standing over a slain demon. One limb was gone. Vito fell to his father's feet in tears, apologizing again and again. He had disobeyed orders and gone into the forbidden forest. It was clear that his recklessness had cost his father dearly. Overcome with guilt, Vito sobbed, wondering why his father saved someone so weak who couldn't even beat his younger siblings, while his father, smiling through the pain, told him to hold his head high since he hadn't noticed Vito whining. Vito was his greatest treasure. If he had to protect it with only half his body, so be it. It was worth being proud of. He warned Vito that fleeing would leave him with regret for the rest of his life. His father told him that one day Vito would learn what it meant for something to matter more than his own life. Those were the last words Vito ever heard from his father. Standing before a jeering crowd of Maledic's men, Vito says nothing. They mocked him, saying he thought he could stop them. One called him crazy, laughing at the idea that he could take on 100 alone, and the others recalled what Maledic had said. A former knight could not be trusted, not even as far as he could be thrown. There would be no escape this time, no chance to run away. Vito once again pictured the chains that had bound him. He had fled once before to save his life, yet the years that followed were no better than death. He silently apologized to his father for taking the detour and for losing sight of what mattered. It was too late to change what had already happened. Still, something inside him stirred, and he could remember his father's grin, the pride in his voice, the warmth of being called his treasure, and the spirit that once lived in him returned. At last he felt the pride of a knight again, and Vito stopped running and stood his ground. Openly and without shame, he admitted he'd done terrible things with the very man he now faced, and did not expect peace or redemption for someone like him. Confusion spread among the soldiers at his sudden change. Vito refused to hide any longer. If this was the end, so be it. He He would fight, and if he had to fall, he would do it like a true villain with pride and purpose. The man laughed loudly and said he'd always known something was off about Vito, that pity in his eyes for the slaves proved it, that Vito expected those same slaves to show him mercy in return, and that he was walking straight into a massacre as a backstabbing traitor unfit to call himself a knight. The man mocked him, saying he already knew Vito's so-called swordsmanship too well to take him seriously, almost pitying him as just another washed-up ex-knight, until Vito raised his hand and sparks flickered at his fingertips. Lightning surged, and without warning, Vito unleashed a bolt that struck the man square in the chest, sending him backward in a burning arc. The others froze in shock. Confusion spread, and someone muttered in disbelief. It looked like lightning magic. A towering brute named Groton stepped forward and sneered, mocking the idea that the pathetic bastard actually had magic. Calm and sardonic, Vito admitted he might simply be a coward. While others swung swords on the front lines, his role had been as a mage knight, a specialist in magic rather than close combat. Groton scoffed, saying being a mage did not matter. A mage who burns through all their mana becomes deadweight, powerless trash, and the rest of the men rallied around Groton's bravado, shouting their support and cheering him on. Grot grinned viciously, eager to see how long Vito could withstand their full assault. Elsewhere, Meldick watched the scene on a surveillance screen, his expression tightening with irritation at the cowardly knight putting up a fight, and he grumbled he would deal with him soon enough, while nearby Fujimura stood calm but focused, observing Vito's seriousness and silently acknowledging the situation was escalating, so if Vito was stepping up, it was time for him to act too. Fujimura activated his technique without hesitation. His muscles tensed and veins bulged. Smoke hissed from his body when he opened the second gate. He had mailed it and even caught the name Second Gate, and he was still trying to process it. Fujimura had already moved on, muttering that this was what a core at full capacity really looked like, a full-throttle surge of power like something launched straight out of hell, and Meldick blinked, unfamiliar with the concept of core. Undeterred, Fujimura declared he was on the clock. There would be no more holding back. From then on it was all or nothing, and it was time to go all out. They bore a satisfied air as the battle grew more intense. Finally, they were starting to get serious. Of all the resistance groups, Fujimura's eyes annoyed him the most. They had something in them he couldn't stand. The ground split open. Thorn-covered limbs burst through the floor, followed by hands. Then bodies, dozens of failed test subjects, rose like puppets from a nightmare. Meldick's discarded test pieces were grotesque and malformed, but powerful. Despite being failures, Meldick said they still had more than enough strength to wipe out a squad of B-class seconds. There were 66 of them in total, all under his command. Before he could finish boasting, several of them were already airborne, effortlessly tossed aside by Fujimura's brutal assault. Meldick stared in disbelief as Fujimura taunted him. He laughed at his creation's pathetic strength. Being pitted against something so fragile felt disrespectful. He planned to end the fight quickly. Unfazed, his penis triggered a mechanism. The box-shaped vessel at his side activated and released enhancements to the resurrected creatures. Stronger magic, pain suppression, forced physical agitation, and increased durability. He was sure he had them cornered. On another screen, Visca won by checkmate and gripped El Tico by the head. Her body lay limp, barely conscious. Visca said their defeat was sealed the moment they made enemies of his organization. Sneering, he wondered why his allies were taking so long. If they kept dragging their feet, he'd have to finish the job himself. Freya cried out as she watched El Tico and felt Bistro's grip tighten. Despite the pain, El Tico managed a faint smirk. Something inside Bastilla snapped. He slammed her to the ground. Spitting furious curses, she kept pushing. Seeing her only made him more enraged. He said he would no longer follow Meldick's orders to keep her alive. He'd cave her skull in and wipe that smirk off her face for good, lifting his arm to deliver a killing blow. Gasping for breath, El Tico could only watch. Her mind flashed with memories, a faint smile, and apologies whispered to her. And to her mom. Something moved. Pip's eyes widened in horror as someone darted between them. Freya, frail but determined. She shielded El Tico with her own body. Vistus's fist crashed down. Freya collapses to the floor. Visca's prosthetic arm clattered beside her, shattered. She stared in shock. Snapping in annoyance, he told her to wait her turn because he had a dessert he'd been saving. El Tico called to Freya but got no reply, only a faint twitch of her hand, and her barely coherent thoughts reached him as she apologized, admitting the pain she had endured for someone like her. Countless joyful, sad, and unknown experiences must have shaped El Tico's life. Freya asked her to rest and stop fighting alone. From then on, she would be under Freya's protection. At that moment, El Tico heard her mother's voice again, Live on Lafral. One day you will have people who cared for you deeply." The words rang in her spirit. Livid, Bischa stomped on Frey's body and screamed in frustration. Frey would not die, and her arms were absurdly tough. Eltico froze, horror and fury churning inside her, while the vessel in Maldix's hand pulsed and suddenly grew hot, and he hissed in pain as the surge of heat hit him. Inside the chamber, Pip cried out, demanding Bastilla remove his foot from Freya. Then another voice joined her, fierce, resolute. That was Eltico. Bischa glared at Eltico. He was incredulous that she dared order him, but she stood firm, locking eyes with him and repeating that he should lift his leg off Freya. A blinding flash of light suddenly erupted from LTCO's body. Bisti tensed as his instincts kicked in. He jumped back immediately, shaken. That overwhelming surge, raw and lethal, was unmistakable. It couldn't be. The seal had been broken. Elsewhere, Mildek felt it too, the vessel in his hands burning his skin and glowing with volatile energy. He cursed under his breath as the power grew more unstable than he'd expected, and with all his strength he forced the seal closed just in time. The heat subsided and he panted, shaken. Eltico nearly shattered the seal, which terrified him. She was far more dangerous than he had expected. He realized it then. He needed to kill her immediately, before things spun out of control. He looked up at the battlefield and saw Fujimura alone, still standing. Mage stared, stunned. Moments earlier, Fujimura had been overwhelmed, and now he stood upright and unshaken, and Mage muttered in disbelief. People wondered if Fujimura had used a transition spell. Fujimura calmly said there was no magic, no tricks, he just had legs like a horse. Maldek braced himself, convincing himself Fujimura was just another brute. Even if the others had fallen, his elite barrier still stood, far stronger than anything they'd tried to break. Before he could finish the thought, Fujimura swung his wrench hard, the air cracked, and the barrier shattered into fragments. Malech's eyes widened, and before he could react, Fujimura pulled something from his pocket and threw it into the sky. Small metal parts like screws. They glittered in the air, seeming harmless, and Maldek sneered in confusion when he saw they were just nails and junk. The instant the screws struck his body, his thoughts scattered. A crushing weight slammed into him as the projectiles hit. Hardened by body-strengthening magic and launched by Fujimura's enhanced swing, the screws embedded deep in his flesh. He hit the ground hard. Each screw was a super-dense, fast, precise missile, ideal when flung by Fujimura's wrench. They were not random tools, but accurate, deadly weapons in his hands, perfect for a one-handed throw, and he needed no spells or enchanted blades, only those little knives and a wrench, and even lying on the ground wounded and gasping, he still clutched the vessel in his hand. Desperation took hold, and Fujimura hissed through clenched teeth as he activated it again, saying, "Come on out, More," while narrowing his eyes and watching for whatever else was coming. A turbulent thought stirred in Maldix's mind, wondering who or what the boy standing before him was. Fujimura stood up and calmly took in the scene. Before he reached for his megaphone, he shouted to his comrades. Barely conscious on the ground, Freya twitched in response. Though her body was limp, her will was not completely broken. Vito, bloodied and out of breath, forced out a strained boss. Pip shouted Fujimura's name, while El Tico stayed silent and seemed lost in thought. Fujimura's voice cut through the chaos, urging them to hold on a little longer. He assured them he would end this now. Maldek moved with Anis while the 100 men surrounding him scoffed, laughing that a mere boy could finish it. Fujimura moved down toward Maldek without wavering. Bischa, seeing this, said the others were finished and charged at El Tico with a roar. Refusing to back down, Hip spread her arms to protect her. Bischa sneered at her defiance, amused by her small size and fierce determination, mocking her for trying to act as a shield. Freya could barely whisper Pip's name, her heart heavy. Inside Maldek the urge to destroy flared again. He had always wiped out any opposition. He would do it again, allowing no exceptions. He called forth Magu, a monstrous being. Charging straight at Fujimura, Maldek vowed to drain every last drop of his mana. Fujimura wasn't facing him. Launching upward, he suddenly appeared in front of Maletic using a transition technique. With stern resolve, Fujimura caught the tyrant off guard and unleashed the full weight of Maldix's sins on him. Lives torn apart and the grief of those left behind. Those long years of pain and anguish. The divine chisel struck the sealed box, releasing a tremendous explosion. Maldek was felled. Fujimura whispered an apology to Nagajeji for the delay. The box began to crack as a small fissure widened until the entire seal broke. Fujimura grant. El Tico was free. Shattered pieces of the box fell as Maldek collapsed lifeless to the ground. Danger still looms. Bischa lunged at Pip with savage intent, and vowed to tear her apart. The claws is struck forward, only to find empty air. Now El Tico stood where there had been no one, having moved swiftly and silently to shield Pip just in time. Pip looked up, astonished, wide-eyed, and speechless. El Tico stood transformed. All her wounds were gone and her hair flowed. Her clothes were radiant and new. Fujimura watched with a smirk. Freya's eyes flickered open, catching sight of the reborn El Tico. El Tico lifted Pip with steady arms, ready to protect her. Bischa stared in disbelief, unsure who the woman was. El Tico gave a simple answer, Lafral. One man, reflecting on his jobless struggle, considered trying Bonus next. The other man laughed and warned him to avoid Bonus at all costs. As the continent's financial capital and a draw for thrill seekers, Bonus was a dangerous place to leave, since only the richest could afford to live there, and for everyone else the choices were grim, death, slavery, or addiction. Zafat, the criminal organization, had its headquarters there, and the city was overrun by its thugs. Crime there was among the highest on the continent. The first man asked about the powerful figures said to be planning to stop it. The second man spread rumors that ministers and aristocrats were on Zafat's payroll, and the economy was now so tied to the organization that no one seemed to care. The wealthy wasted their fortunes, while slaves toiled in the shadows. The city had already been taken over, and even the great sage, once considered a solution, was powerless. The first man doubted it, but the second said he'd heard disturbing stories of children being kidnapped and forced to dig tunnels. Reality was grim, and commoners could do nothing about it. That was the sad truth of Bonus. Elsewhere, El Tico braced herself to carry out the punishment she planned. Bastia scoffed and said he had expected more from someone known as the strongest weapon, but El Tico was the same as before except for a slight change in hair color. El Tico hid Pip behind her and remembered Fujimura saying her gear could gather mana. Bastia wrote her off as weak, but Lafril stepped forward. She rose into the air. A spell was cast that wrapped Bischa in a swirling black wind. They chanted laughably. A tornado developed. Bischa tried to fight back, swinging his fist in defiance. Something was wrong, he heard a snap. He felt his fingers snap and twist in every direction. A violent gale hit him. Vischa cried out in pain as the wind kept battering him. A figure suddenly appeared before him, El Tico. Clad in full armor, their eyes fixed with stern determination. Bischa lay trapped beneath her. From a distance, Fujimura murmured to Nagajiji and urged her to unleash the full power of her winds. El Tico's armor glinted as she jumped into the tornado. Her boots transformed into drill-like weapons. Bischa tried to run, but it was too late. Elti's boots slammed into his chest with devastating force. His ribs cracked. He was thrown to the ground. Blood poured from his face, and within moments he lay a bloody mess. El Tico stood unfazed. That rage revealed the emptiness of previous actions. Grinning, Fujimura spoke to the Zafat lackeys through a megaphone. They announced that their leader and top enforcer were out of commission indefinitely. Battered and weary, Vito, Freya, and Pip felt a wave of relief wash over them. Fujimura ended with a mocking comment, calling the Zafat forces nothing but sore losers and idiots. The men murmured among themselves in disbelief. Fujimura's presence and actions baffled them. It was impossible to understand how he could still be standing, let alone fighting back. Their confusion deepened as they tried to figure out how the brat could still fight. Still alive after defeating two formidable enemies, he made one of them realize that whoever had done it must be unimaginably dangerous. Vito, bruised and battered, confirmed their suspicion with a grim laugh, guessing the victors were headed their way at that moment, and panic spread as the men scattered in all directions. Calm settled briefly, and Vito sighed deeply, realizing his time to die had not yet come. Still catching her breath, Freya turned toward El Tico with quiet awe, acknowledging what had just happened, but the moment didn't have time to settle. El Tico suddenly faltered and collapsed. A sharp hiss came from her hair as she hit the ground, and Freya's eyes widened in shock. A weak cough nearby broke the silence. Mangled and barely alive, she lay as he wheezed and rasped that El Tico's body must have reached its limit. She had awakened to a power far beyond what her body could bear, made worse by earlier wounds. It was too much. To him, she was already as good as dead. He still thought it was worth witnessing her full, true form, Fujimura watching everything unfold. He refused to believe that El Tico would die. Slamming his hand on the ground, he focused. By applying second-tier hardening to his current power, he might still find what he needed in a dungeon of this level. The core was his target, and he had to pinpoint its location. He searched like someone hunting a magic stone, remembering Freya had once told him no one had eyes like his. Now is the time to prove they really were unique. Fujimura took his vision further. Wider, deeper, sharper than success, he found the gun. His clairvoyant eye activated on Washington. With its coordinates fixed, he prepared to move his body to that exact spot. El Tico lay unconscious. Paralyzed by fear and helplessness, Freya could only watch. Her mind refused to accept it. El Tico couldn't be gone. Thoughts raced. Memories flashed before her. She willed her awake. Her voice grew desperate. A gunshot rang out. Freya's eyes snapped open and locked onto El Ticos as they fluttered back to life. Smoke drifted from the barrel of the gun. Fujimura loomed over her, grinning. They announced the battle was over and that they had survived. At last they could relax. Tears welled in Freya's eyes as El Tico gave him a subtle thumbs up. She was overcome with emotion. Act quickly to embrace Fujimura. She sobbed against him as he smiled, relieved. Elsewhere, Maldic lay sprawled on the ground, still breathing, his mind reeling at the healing spell Fujimura had cast that he could not understand. A warrior able to pair such high-level physical techniques with healing magic at that scale was unheard of, not just a multi-attribute caster, but a genuine multi-expert, something beyond anything they had seen. It was beyond anything he'd ever encountered, and in Maldic's final thoughts the truth became clear. Before them stood no longer just a man. Fujimura had become a magnificent monster, and he rallied the group, declaring it was time to reconnect with their old ally and finish liberating the remaining slaves. He fired the gun at Vito without hesitation. The gun's magic restored Vito's body, and Vito silently pointed toward a slave labor site. They came upon a grim scene. Countless slaves worked, digging without end. The overseer sat relaxed in his chair until Fujimura struck him from behind with a heavy wrench. The blow knocked him off balance and sent him tumbling to the ground. From above, Fujimura raised a megaphone and declared the workers free. The reaction came instantly and was explosive. Shackles shattered, the slaves broke into cheers, their joy raw and overwhelming as voices rose together to thank Fujimura, and at last they were free with no more forced labor and no more endless holes to dig. During the celebration, a man joked that Freya should marry his son. Caught off guard, Freya froze. Meanwhile, Pip sniffed the air and picked up a scent. She signaled to Fujimura and they followed her lead. They eventually reached a hidden cave and discovered another prison cell inside. Inside, a frail, motionless old man was trapped. Fujimura stared at the scene with disgust, quietly condemning anyone who would kidnap the elderly and thinking such scum were beneath contempt, then sawed through the bars. Fujimura freed the old man and hoisted him onto his back, then rejoined the group and carried him with a light, easy manner. Asked where he'd been, he patted the old man's head and said he had found him deeper in the cave, at first mistaking him for a Jizo statue, a small stone figure common in Japan that represents the guardian deity of children and travelers, and then laughed as he admitted how close he came to leaving the old man behind. The elderly man stood calmly, unmoved by the commotion around him. Freya's eyes widened as realization struck her. Fujimura kept joking, rubbing the man's bald head like a mischievous child, and teasing that the master might be sensing a disturbance in the force. Freya could hardly take it in. The old man standing before them, humble and silent, was none other than the great sage of Bonus. Fujimura, taken aback, confirmed it with surprise. The sage himself affirmed it. The man was the town's former head, the great sage once known as Soluin, the pinnacle of knowledge and a master of light magic. The sage turned to Fujimura sincerely and asked how he could now show his gratitude for the kindness he had received. Everyone around them stood stunned. The old sage gave the gathered crowd a warm smile. The former slaves over. They were overwhelmed with emotion and expressed relief and joy that the great sage had survived. With his return, they believed they finally had a chance to drive out the oppressive Zafet organization and restore the peace they once knew. Nearby, Fujimura noticed another group of figures standing stiffly with distant expressions. He asked who they were. Freya said they were nobles and ministers of Bonus who had also been captured. Fujimura remarked on the deep trust they must have placed in the sage. Freya agreed, noting such reverence was natural for someone like. Fujimura said getting himself captured wasn't a wise move for someone of his stature. Philosoph flinched at the jab. Explained that he was captured while asleep. Fujimura reacted skeptically. Philosoph clarified that it was the Magu, and even alert soldiers probably would not have stood a chance in the same situation. Peculiar pride lit his face as he mused that, given who he was, it was only natural he alone could have come out alive. No one else could have survived such an ordeal. Fujimura stayed unimpressed and mocked the claim, saying the sage was hardly old enough to sleep so deeply. Philosoph's face darkened, as he called Fujimura the worst young person he had met in his 300 years. Fujimura shot back that those centuries must have been miserable. Freya, flustered, bowed and apologized to the sage over and over. Zoth smiled gently and reassured her. Having seen the group's actions and efforts, he was ready to vouch for them. One had divine eyes, another was a demon elf, and with them were a cleric of the Lantern Flame, a former knight of Empirizer, and even a child of the White Wolf tribe. Whether fate or something else brought them together, the group they formed was undeniably extraordinary. Freya blinked at the mention of the Lantern Flame and asked Philosoph to explain. Philosoph looked surprised. Freya admitted she really did not know. Philosoph explained. The Lantern Flame was a rare talent that produced explosive fire with one hand while using that same heat to heal with the other, giving a double benefit. As far as he knew, only one person could wield such a gift, the current Flame Princess of Saluan. He remembered her name as Moraz von Freja or something close to that. Freja froze. That was her late mother's name. She was stunned and demanded to know more. Philosoph looked at her curiously. Dead, she asked. Are you certain? People believed Maraz had died about 15 years ago, but there were rumors she had been seen in the Beastman nation of Fanga. Freya could hardly believe what she heard. Philosoph offered more context. Those old rumors came from a rural part of Fanga, from the White Wolf village. His gaze drifted to Pip, the tribe's child, and he declared that fate was at work. Fujimura grinned with resolve. He decided immediately. The path ahead was clear. Their next destination was the beast kingdom of Fanga. Freya, still emotional, asked what would become of Izuma. Fujimura replied with steady resolve. If there was even a slim chance Mares was alive, they could not waste any time. He believed nothing mattered more than the bond between a parent and a child. Tears brimmed in Freya's eyes, and her voice trembled with gratitude as she looked at Fujimura. Fujimura turned his attention to Vito. She asked what he planned to do next, and Vito smiled faintly. He shared his decision that he would return to Empirizer. If he truly wanted to start anew, he had to do it properly. Freya, alarmed, reminded him that the Empire's harshest law made desertion punishable by death. Vito brushed it off with bitter humor, seeing himself as nothing more than a cowardly executive who ran when trouble began, and maybe that made sense. Still, he looked back on his time with the group, how every day with them and the boss was anything but dull, and how, despite who he was, he'd ended up saving people, a fact he met with sincere gratitude. Philosoph spoke up and offered Vito a position under him. Stunned, Vito listened as Philosoph explained they would need manpower for the coming reconstruction, and that, if he truly wanted to make amends, he should earn forgiveness through action. Vito protested that as a deserter and a Zafet executive, his past would make him a target, and involving Philosoph would only bring trouble, but Philosoph brushed it off and said they'd hide him. He turned to the former slaves, and they all nodded. Then Philosoph leaned in and asked if Vito had ever heard of a statewide cover-up. Philosoph had seen Vito's actions himself, and believed Vito still had the resolve to risk his life to try to reclaim his honor as a knight. The weight of those words struck Vito, and his eyes widened. It felt like it could continue. If after all the rebuilding was done, things still did not work out, then so be it, but it was not too late to start over. Fujimura gave Vito a firm pat on the back, grinning, and said it was a good deal. He laughed and reminded him that failure was a privilege of the young. They could fail again and again, and still find the strength to get up each time. Vito remembered that laugh. It was the same kind his father once had, and a tear slipped down his cheek. Offering a soft thanks to the boss, he reached for his soth and accepted the offer. This time he vowed not to run away again. Fujimura clapped his hands together. With that settled, it was time to move. Freya eagerly agreed. As they were about to set off, a voice thundered from above, stopping them. Vito froze. His eyes darted up and widened in horror. The attitude was hand-loomed. Malech's face twisted with fury. With the organization ruined, he expected that man to kill him soon. If that was his fate, he resolved to drag everyone else down with him. Fujimura muttered under his breath and clarified the names as Philosoph, Grim and Calm, saying they meant Alamumi, commander of the 6th Division of the Demon King's army, who had given the Magu the cursed cure that allowed Philosoph to be captured. Philosoph warned that Al-Yamumi's influence was spreading across the continent like a shadowy plague, aiming not for simple conquest, but to undermine the balance of power from within by any means, using a strategy unlike any seen before built on stealth, subversion, and dark tactics from the inside, and an unprecedented threat was rising. Melt confirmed Philosoph's analysis. He had targeted Bonus for its wealth, and his plan was simple but devastating: seize the city and cut off its funding to the front lines. With the windfall, he would mass-produce a vanguard of demons and rot the nation from within. It was a quiet, calculated betrayal. It was aimed not at a foreign power, but at his fellow countrymen. A surge of raw energy erupted. El Tico's body tensed and her power flared, her eyes glowing red with thin cracks across them, but her strength gave out and she collapsed to the ground with a thud. Felasuth said grimly that her body had regained its physical integrity, but her mana reserves were still dangerously depleted as long bone tentacles began to twist out from Maldix's back. Using them as limbs, he moved forward, his skeletal appendages sliding across the ground with unnatural ease. Notice that when someone is driven into a corner, they often turn to forbidden arts, powers so destructive they demand the user's life in exchange. A dreadful magic had awakened. Freya, shaken, doubted such power could exist. Philosothus fell silent. Then from the land's arcane depths, long-buried skeletons began to stir, summoned by a chilling chant. Skeletal warriors rose from the ground and advanced toward him one by one. They fused into him as he gave his life as fuel. Bones clunked together, corpses piled into his body. He was no longer a man but an amalgamated monstrosity, a massive, pulsing, constructed death. Seeing the madness, Fujimura cursed at him. Maldek declared the act final. It was the end. There was no escape. Watching from a distance, the former slave stood frozen with fear. The abomination swelled to colossal size, its weight and shape casting a shadow like a falling star. Vito watched in horror as what hovered above them turned out to be not a spell but a corpse-pressurized bomb, a weapon meant to annihilate, and the arcane energy throbbed until it became a deafening, monstrous roar that tore through the chamber. Vito realized the whole labyrinth was about to collapse. Philosoth composed himself. He summoned a shimmering array of radiant barriers, his old battle formation of light walls. Years had passed since he last called on it. The massive force bearing down on them was overwhelming, yet he stood firm. Freya watched in awe as Philosoph, the great sage himself, held back that monstrous construct of death alone. With unwavering resolve, Philosoph declared his spirit would not break. A sharp crack came from his back, and he winced as the spell drained his mana so fast he could not hold on much longer, and Fujimura, ever the realist, said what everyone was thinking. Philosoph had thrown out his back. He moved at once, grabbed Freya's arm, and said it was now or never. From that distance, she could fire with full force as she guided her hand to aim her weapon. Fujimura offered to be her right hand. Freya, breath caught, acknowledged him. Onlookers doubted them, unable to believe a small weapon could affect something so massive. Fujimura snapped at Philosoph to bring the wall down, and panic rippled through the group as Philosoph hesitated. He then accepted Fujimura's call. The barrier wasn't going to last anyway, so gambling on Fujimura's reckless confidence might be worth the risk. Everyone watches the pair, holding their breath. Fujimura lent Freya some of his energy and told her to show everyone what the one-armed hero could do. Vito repeated the word hero. Fujimura Grint felt good about this and urged Freya to let everything out and fire every shot she had. Freya nodded and pulled the trigger. Fujimura chanted Voidal Sky Sixfold and an eruption followed. The blast tore through the air with a thunderous roar as smoke and wind surged. When it cleared, the abomination that had loomed over them was gone. In its place was only a gaping hole. Vito stared, looked stunned, and smiled. Nothing could have survived that. The scale of the attack left Freya, Pip, and even El Tico speechless. Fujimura laughed and teased them. The three looked utterly exhausted, and it wasn't just the gear that would need some R&R when they got back. Philosoph chuckled, saying they only survived the battle because of Fujimura's finely crafted tools, and Freya blushed as her thoughts turned to Fujimura. The once doubtful nobles and ministers stepped forward and bowed sincerely. On behalf of Bonus, they offered their deepest gratitude. They declared their support for Fujimura's group and pledged to help however they could on the journey ahead. Fujimura thanked them and said next time they were in town, they should all share a good meal. Fujimura turned to Vito and called to him, saying he had high hopes and that if Vito could stand against 100 men, nothing would be beyond his reach. Tears filled Vito's eyes. Remembering his father's voice, he heard "Go forth, Vito, and follow your heart." His father believed in him and had called Vito his treasure. Vito cried while Fujimura gently patted his back, vowed not to repeat his past mistakes, and promised he would return to fight by Fujimura's side once he was strong enough. Fujimura, stand up. Still beat as ever, he announced he was starving and suggested they all head into town. Then something struck him. He cried out in dismay. Startled, Freya asked if something was wrong. Fujimura turned to the sage urgently and asked whether he knew what tobacco was. Philosoph spun around, acting overly innocent. Philosoph pretended he had no idea while Fujimura tried to explain that you light dried leaves, inhale, and smoke comes out. But Philosoph kept up the act, still insisting he had no clue, and a frustrated Fujimura told him to think harder and called him an old fart. Scoffing at the title Great Sage, he muttered that someone who doesn't even know what tobacco is can't be a sage, snorted in exasperation, and said maybe all it took to be a sage was chronic back pain, while Philly's oath smirked that even if he didn't know tobacco, Fujimura would be the last person he'd tell, anyone else sure. But not him, Freya called to Fujimura, alarmed, as he suddenly stormed up to the sage and confronted him face to face, his voice cracking with raw emotion as he accused Philisoth, the tiny hope, the one possibility that had kept him going through this insane journey, and now it was gone, leaving Freya bewildered that something like tobacco could cause such a breakdown and beginning to scare her. Philisoth chuckled and tossed a crude jab, saying the younger generation, especially those who weren't fully mature down there, should watch their words. Fujimura squinted and shot back that Philisoth was one to talk, his head so shiny it could be used as a mirror. Philisoth's face twisted in outrage, as he insisted he still had a few strands left. Fujimura said that was not something to be proud of, and called him a wrinkled old fart. Freya turned to Eltico and begged her to step in and stop the two from sinking further into childish bickering. Eltico stayed quiet, simply standing there with a gentle smile as memories of her mother came back, and her mother's words echoed that she should live on and laugh for both of us. Eltico remembered the wish she had been told that one day she would smile from the bottom of her heart. Her name Lafrel meant smiling face. In that moment she let out a wide, open-mouthed grin. Everyone turned toward her in shock, and she quietly reaffirmed her resolve to live up to the wish and carry the name Lafrel with pride. And smile freely and genuinely. Fujimura gasped, Nagajiji smiled, and that day it was done. The continent's greatest criminal syndicate, Zafat, was eradicated not by an army or the nobles, but by a single adventuring party. They didn't know someone had been watching, and from a shadowed spot far away, a figure let out a quiet chuckle. The plan had failed, the man muttered in disdain. All the effort he'd gone through to lend mail to Gamamu had amounted to nothing. Humans, as always, were a disappointing species. A small, grotesque, floating brain-like demon hovered beside him and agreed. Alamumi thought about the weapon they had seen at the end and found it extraordinary, and asked the creature beside him if it had ever heard of the dwarfs. He remembered they were an ancient race of master blacksmiths whose work was so divine it angered the gods and caused their extinction, and believed every SS-class weapon in existence today traced its roots to those legendary forges. Even rarer than SS-class were sacred weapons like the Magu, not mere tools but unique relics and lost treasures crafted with designs so intricate modern smiths could not replicate. They were made by something beyond humans, something divine, the floating demon thought, an ancient artifact that even surpassed SS-class sounded too mythical. Alamumi explained that such treasures were said to have been forged by the very first of the dwarfs, their originator. The one who struck the first hammer on the anvil, the blacksmith above, and all others. They called him the Grand Warp, according to legend. A myth, a foundation, and possibly a future threat. Between human and demon territory stood a border called the Absolute Front Line, Edzima. Inside the stronghold, tension brewed. A knight approached General Ruel with urgent news that the second defense gate had been breached. This happened only recently. Ruel, the wily, imperial general of sharp mind and sharper instinct, paused to remember who had been assigned to that gate. It was Amista, the iron-clad, the righteous general. That night made clear Amista had temporarily left her post to support the third gate, and the enemy used that opening to overrun the second. Ruhul muttered, unsurprised. That was typical of Amista, moving in on others even at tactical risk. A mocking, amused voice came from above them. A figure sitting above the others chuckled and dismissed it as sweet. Ruel recognized him immediately. Saul was in Flightum, the unsinkable. Flightum spoke with reckless bravado. He said loudly that Idzuma was unchanged, still a land of opportunity. Recapturing that second gate on his own, he thought he'd earn style points, even if only half. Ruel faced him, incredulous and wondering if Flightum understood the full weight of his words. She reminded him that who wins in battle depends on sound strategy and numbers, and that they needed proper planning, not the Atrix. Flightum shrugged it off. He did not care. As a Saluan, he worked as a freelance warrior. Saluans like him were not bound by protocol or command. They came to Azuma drawn by the promises of freedom, glory, riches, and the status offered by top-tier quests. Even the knights felt stiff and constrained beside them. He added that Heflin had also shown up, but the prize he wanted was a different kind. Eula agreed, remembering that Heflin had made himself a near-permanent fixture at the fourth gate under General Aklina's command, and Flightum grinned knowingly and warned those listening that Heflin was a fool and a stalker in disguise. As soon as Heflin heard about the breach of the second gate, Flightum knew he would rush there to impress the female general, and since the gate was not secure yet, Flightum decided to act first and get there before Heflin. He was going to steal the show. Alarmed, Rahl asked to go with him, A demon general's involvement would make it too dangerous for even a Solowent to go alone. Before she could finish, Flatum cut her off. She didn't understand. That was the whole point. If Flatum pulled this off alone, he'd become a legend. Surrounding knights stood slack-jawed, unable to believe it. Rewel asked in deadpan sarcasm what sort of legend he imagined himself becoming, adding that he did not see himself as a god of war and was, if anything, shaping up to be a legendary fool. Deep down, Rewel was captivated despite her sharp words. He was ridiculous, almost unhinged, but he gave off a freedom that cut through rules, fear, and reason, and she blushed against her will. Flydom announced with a flourish that the legend of Phldom had just begun. He sprang from the stronghold and shot forward at incredible speed. Rewel could only sigh and mutter, "That Flydom." All his glory was headed the wrong way, meanwhile in the royal palace. The king reeled in disbelief when a messenger reported that the Zophat, had been annihilated in a single day, that a group led by a woman known for exceptional firearm skills carried out the attack, and that a young man had been seen traveling with them. The king weighed rumors of firearms, a young man, and Zophat's collapse, and his thoughts turned immediately to Fujimura and Freya, so it had to be them, and he chuckled at the flashy chaos he expected from those chasing the mantle of hero. Determined, he would wait as long as it took for Fujimura to return, and when that day came they'd resume the feast they shared when they first met, and then Fujimura suddenly appeared and announced his return. The king froze in disbelief. At first he thought it was only a memory, but it was real. Fujimura stood there with the remains of a massive skeleton, offering them to the king as a gift. Fujimura said it was grilled ray and paired well with alcohol, casually waved goodbye without missing a beat, said he was in a hurry and had to go, and when the king called for him to wait, still full of questions, Fujimura was already gone. Back in his workshop, surrounded by stones and spare parts. Inspecting the materials he had acquired, Fujimura saw that, with Bonus's help, he had obtained magic stones unavailable in these parts, proof that Bonus truly deserved its reputation as the continent's top trading hub, and he glanced at Freya's prosthetic arms. An overwhelming amount of work lay ahead, repairing the car, upgrading all their gear, and testing the cores they had retrieved, and memories of the battered Freya and El Tico came back to him. The next upgrades had to focus on defense because they had been too vulnerable. For now, he would start tinkering, getting better at using his special eyes that no one else had, and he needed to make the most of them. Core extraction was a unique power the world had given him alone. As he worked, he gradually realized the cores he handled were far more complex than he first thought. That suited him fine. He would show them and the world his craftsman's soul, so the work continued. That same day, Altico, Freya, and Pip each received newly crafted gear. Boots, arms, and bracelets. The king marveled at the results, beaming with joy as he hugged Fujimura. Freya, visibly moved, promised she would take good care of it. As they climbed into the car, the king asked whether they really intended to leave so soon. Fujimura confirmed that they still had much to do and their journey was far from over. When the king inquired about their next destination, Fujimura Grand announced it was Fangawa, specifically White Wolf Village. With a final wave, the car pulled away. The king repeated the name White Wolf. The official beside him explained that among the Beastmen tribes, the White Wolf was one of the three great clans, alongside the Gold Hawk and the Black Lion, and all three were known for their immense combat strength. Deep in a forest known for countless disappearances, the White Wolf tribe lived in a village in a hellish region where only the strongest survived, and it was worse than that. The White Wolf tribe was known for hating humans. The king froze, utterly stunned. Then he called out Fujimura's name in disbelief. By then, Fujimura's vehicle had already reached the forest. The car stopped at the jungle's edge. He stepped out and surveyed the terrain. They had come this far, but the road wouldn't go any further. From here they'd travel on foot. Freya marked the spot immediately. Finger Territory, the Great Vern Jungle. A vast green expanse that covers nearly a third of the Beastmen country, lies close to the demonic realm and remains largely unexplored, holding mysteries untouched by mankind. Dense, wild, and unforgiving. They had to move with extreme caution. Heavy panting burst through the foliage. Pip's sharp ears picked up the sound at once. A figure ran into view as a massive dinosaur-like beast chased it. The man was clearly in trouble. He cursed his bad luck. Of all days, his beast-wording stone had to fail him now. Completely unprotected, he ran past when Fujimura casually grabbed him by the collar, and the man panicked, shouting that he did not know Fujimura and did not realize he was about to be devoured. He shouted at Fujimura to let go, warning that if the beast caught him, it would strip him to the bone. The creature launched forward as the man screamed again, begging to be freed. But Fujimura, Thomas Ever, casually brought his wrench down on the beast's head. The The creature fell without warning, leaving the man frozen in shock, while Fujimura calmly told the bees to quiet down because he was in the middle of a negotiation. Right after Fujimura fell to the beast, a wave of enormous insects surges toward them, and someone among them identifies the creatures as beast bugs. El Tico immediately used her power. She used a devastating superstorm kick to crush the swarm beneath her boots. Fujimura was surprised by how powerful her attack was against such small targets. She was left doubting the logic because such overwhelming power felt excessive. The threat kept coming. Insects crawled toward her, raising doubts about the elf's safety as the swarm seemed ready to strip her to the bone. Fujimura remained unbothered, noting their garments were not ordinary. They were enchanted with elemental resistance and automatic healing, which made trivial attacks ineffective. He called the clothing Fujimura Kakoromo, clearly proud of the craftsmanship. His companion stood in awe, speechless at the sophistication. Fujimura went on, boasting that the clothing was made in collaboration with the master artisans of Bonus. Fujimura's revelation stunned the listener even more. The armor contained powerful magic stones, precisely machined into lightweight plate mail. Fujimura described how he extracted the stone cores, refined them, and turned them into usable armor. It sounded outrageous at first, but the results proved it was durable, lightweight, and powerful, and its value was clear, almost priceless. More bugs appeared, so Fujimura changed tactics. Fujimura summoned Freya and told her to prepare the next attack. He still saw those creatures as beasts. They often only understood brute force. Their attack lit the sky and cleared the wave. Fujimura has rejoined for you. They stood visibly satisfied with the outcome while their companion watched anxiously. He was clearly shaken by what he had seen. Later, deeper into the forest, the travelers studied a cracked orb of red crystal. Cracks marred the surface from overuse and strain. It had once been a beast-wording magic stone, but was now spent. Fujimura pointed out its failure, noting that even enchanted tools were not immune to poor quality. Introducing himself as Bridge, the traveler said he was a blacksmith and merchant traveling across the continent. Fujimura asked Bridge why he entered such a treacherous forest. Bridge said that for a while merchant connections were everything: information, trade routes, and trust. Exploring different regions, especially underexplored Fangawa, revealed untapped opportunities, rare resources, and unique cultures, and this forest was a treasure trove of unknown magic stones. Bridge thought back over the day's events. After 2 years making his way through the forest, he had finally reached the elusive White Wolf village. Since his protective charms were gone, he had to return to town, and it was uncertain if he could venture back. While an amused Fujimura called it Bridge's lucky day and teased him as a pretty boy, part praise and part light sarcasm. They turned their attention to the White Wolf village as their next destination. Fujimura, determined to reach it, carefully gauged Bridge's willingness to act as their guide as long as his safety was guaranteed. Bridge's eyes lit with realization as they considered the protection their combat prowess offered. He warmed to the idea right away. They sealed their unspoken agreement with a handshake. Bridge embraced the role and pledged to lead them to the elusive village. The village lay deep within the vast expanse of Vern, a region difficult to cross. Bridge relied on the scattered teleportation stones embedded throughout the forest to navigate, and over time he mapped their sequence and general locations. After a painstaking, expensive process, a single misstep could cause dangerous detours. Worse still, the White Wolves were no ordinary tribe. They were one of the 3 great clans and deeply resentful of humans, yet the lure of Fangas's famed gold, silver, and countless undiscovered relics was irresistible. Bridge saw huge potential in opening trade with the White Wolves. It was more than diplomacy. It was a once-in-a-lifetime chance to profit, and a seasoned merchant like him could not ignore it. After a long, difficult journey, they reached the outskirts of their destination. Bridge knew without doubt that the White Wolf village lay ahead. Still, he warned them. The White Wolves were hostile to humans, so caution was essential. Before he finished his warning, Fujimura had already left. He slid down the path into the village without hesitation. Bridge panicked at the sudden move. Fujimura knew nothing about the tribe's customs or culture. Fujimura had barged in as if urgency alone gave him permission, and seeing the resolve in his movements, Bridge could only assume he had a plan to defuse any chaos that might erupt. Left with no choice, Bridge followed him. Almost instantly, the air grew tense as masked warriors from the White Wolves closed in around them. The group was clearly on alert. Bridge, whispering urgently, questioned Fujimura's plan and assumed he had won, while Fujimura stayed composed, confident the presence of children and women would discourage any immediate hostility, but Bridge felt far less sure and silently begged that none of them would provoke the White Wolves. Pressed by the crowd, a young girl clutched Fujimura's arm as a white wolf stepped forward and spoke with cautious suspicion, admitting one of their long-lost kin was among the outsiders, though they were unsure how it happened. The others called for their elder. When the elder appeared, the mood changed. Fujimura faced him directly and made his purpose clear. He had come to return a young member of their tribe who had been abducted, and he gently placed a hand on the child's head. Silence passed between him and the elder. No words followed, only a heavy stare that bore the weight of what was coming. The elder gave his verdict. They would take the child into their care, but their distrust of humans stayed the same. The humans were to leave at once. Bridge tried to speak up to explain the hardships they'd endured getting to the village. Before he could finish his plea, spears were thrown at him as a warning. The elder pointed down at the ground beneath them, as a gray field stretched below the raised platform, and asked if they understood the meaning of what lay beneath. Bridge recognized the site as a burial ground, but he couldn't estimate how many were buried there. The elder recounted the history behind the White Wolves' mistrust, saying that unlike other tribes, the White Wolves, with their rare bloodline and great strength, had always lived under the constant threat of extermination by human clans. The threat became real during the Black Dragon incident several years earlier. A monstrous dragon controlled by humans had ravaged their village. It slaughtered warriors, women, and children without distinction. Survivors were driven from their homes and forced into hiding. A colossal battle axe lay at the center of the gravesite. Fujimura noticed it immediately. The elder said it was the weapon of their ancient champion, Lord Lupus, the legendary White Wolves warrior who once saved the world. That axe was a sacred heirloom and a symbol of the village's pride and resilience. Even that revered relic had been defiled by human hands. For clans like the White Wolves, a weapon was more than a tool. It was their soul, passed down through generations, and especially when carried by a veteran, each weapon held history and honor. Desecrating such a relic was an unforgivable insult and a sign of the selfish conflicts caused by humans. Bridge, taking in the weight of everything, admitted that the physical and emotional damage was likely beyond repair. Trust, once broken, rarely mends. The elder, with heavy finality, asked whether they now understood why no human could ever be trusted again. Fujimura stepped forward and proposed that if the humans who broke their pride could not be trusted, trust should be placed in the humans who would restore it. A bold offer hung in the air. He vowed to restore what was lost with action, not words. The elder, taken aback, asked what the offer meant. The greatest deeds stood on full display. A young white wolf child watched it, eyes sparkling and heart pounding. Nearby, an adult white wolf noticed and said the child had come to see the axe again. The child turned, delighted to see his father. The father explained that the deeds belonged to the legendary White Wolf who fought with the hero's party and defeated the Demon King. They were the deeds of Lord Lupus, the pride and treasure of their White Wolf village, said to cleave the earth with a single swing. Their people had protected and honored it for generations. The father spoke of his journey, dedicating his whole life to becoming a warrior worthy of it. To him, the axe was a symbol and a guiding light for the whole tribe, and the boy beamed brighter. He declared that one day he would become a warrior worthy of the axe. His father encouraged him, named him Fulman, and told him to be a warrior who would fall to neither man nor demon. Back in the present, the village elder turned to Fujimura and challenged his claim that he could repair the axe and restore their pride, and Fujimura replied confidently, while Bridge cut in skeptically to advise quitting now on professional grounds. The axe was beyond saving. The thick metal was shattered and rusted through, and the embedded magic stone was spent. Recasting would mean melting it down and starting from scratch. They probably didn't even have a mold for an artifact that old. The magic stone was so degraded, they couldn't tell what kind it had been. Fujimura activated his analysis ability, the Kaizekigen, and his vision saw a glow inside the stone, letting him discern its true nature. Announcing it was an Earth-type rock crusher stone with crystals attuned to ground manipulation, he examined the axe further and sent a connection to a floating stone. A growl from the warrior behind the elder stopped him, the warrior angry that Fujimura had dared to touch the axe. The elder stopped him, turned to Fujimura, and asked how he had known the magic stone's nature. Fujimura said he could see it with his special eye, and promised that if given one day, he would restore the axe to as good as new. The others reacted in disbelief, convinced a single day was impossible and that the boy was mocking them, yet the elder stayed quiet as his thoughts drifted back to the thrill of his own youthful dreams. He chose wisely, but if Fujimura failed, daring to touch the sacred rites would cost him dearly. The man behind the elders moved again, but Fujimura accepted the terms with confidence. Fujimura retrieved a tool from his spatial storage. The bridge reacted with awe. Fujimura then put on his gloves. He announced he would start with arc welding. Arc welding uses the heat of an electrical arc to melt and join metals, producing temperatures from 2,000 to 5,000 degrees Celsius. First, rust was removed from the parts to be welded, then groove welding was carried out. Shaping the materials before welding ensures a strong, clean weld. Machine joints give the metal pieces maximum bonding strength. Bridge watched in quiet admiration. Fujimura warned the onlookers to stay back because the arc flame was very bright. He handed out protective face shields to those who insisted on watching. First come, first served, and 3 members of the White Wolf tribe eagerly took one each. Fujimura inspected the damaged edge of the axis and found the thickest section was 15 to 20 millimeters, so he increased the electrical current and planned 4 to 5 single-stroke passes along the joint once preparations were complete to ensure weld integrity. He started the arc. A sudden burst of energy startled the beast men, and the sight looked like a bolt of lightning. Fujimura first secured the base material to keep it from shifting. The goal was to achieve a full penetration weld without using a backing plate. He began the first layer, carefully adjusting rod height, movement, and speed while watching the weld pool, the molten area that forms during welding. Once the first pass was complete, he removed the slag, the waste that separates during welding. If left, slag can compromise the weld, and its scattered residue, called spatter, can cause further imperfections. On the second layer, Fujimura raised the current and used a weaving motion with the rod to ensure full fusion. Layer by layer, he repeated the process, welding, removing slack, and checking the weld pool and the bead was the semi-cylindrical seam of metal left by each pass. The air rang with the sound of molten metal. Bridge watched, entranced. Fujimura carried on confidently and tacked the cylinder along its circumference to reinforce it. He cleared the remaining rust, polished the surface, and removed excess beads. The metal was treated to prevent future rust, and decorative machining was added. Regarding the shattered magic stone, he said they needed a complete replacement and would require full support from Bonus. Elsewhere, Gramps, the elder, was soaking in a bath when his communication device lit up. A voice rang out to check if he was still alive. The surprised elder reacted when he realized it came from the earring Fujimura had given him, and Fujimura explained it was a transceiver. Apologizing for the abrupt contact, he listed the exact stones he needed prepared right away and said he would come collect them when ready, leaving the elder stunned by the request. Bridge watched the scene and asked Freya who Fujimura was talking to. Freya said casually that it was probably Lord Felisoth, the great sage of Bonus. At first it didn't register, but when it did, Bridge was floored. Bonus was very far away, and it was hard to believe Fujimura had a direct line to someone of that caliber, especially since he had never heard of such a ridiculously convenient form of communication magic. Wanting one, he watched the 3 women traveling with Fujimura proudly display their transceivers. Fujimura said the elders' connections and extra cooperation would get the magic stones here quickly, then went back to work and said it was time to wrap things up. Later, water rushed over the bridge, washing it away. Fujimura grinned. The axe was finished. The elder's eye widened. A rush of childhood memories flooded him, bringing back the awe and admiration he had once felt. The act looked new. It was the exact image of the relic he had washed with reverence as a boy. The beastmen murmured in amazement. One said he'd never seen such a shine. Another called it a miracle. Someone even said it was the exact image of the hero he remembered from his youth, maybe even more so now. Fujimura asked the elder for his opinion, noting the gilding and restored core were a small bonus from him. Bridge stood dumbfounded as Fujimura restored the legendary axe in a single day and displayed techniques far beyond anything he had ever seen, leaving him shaking and overwhelmed with emotion. Bridge bowed low, pressing his forehead to the ground as he called Fujimura master. Moved beyond words by Fujimura's skills, dedication, and spirit, he begged to become Fujimura's disciple. Fujimura declined without hesitation. Bridgewind could not accept it and turned to Freya, calling her dear sister as he begged her to persuade Fujimura. Freya blinked, surprised at the sudden title. The elder spoke. Recognizing Fujimura's help and the matter of the white wolf cub, he declared that out of their people's pride Fujimura would have free passage in and out of the white wolf village. Fujimura's companions cheered. The elder said they would never forget the death they owed him, for example the way of the white wolves. It was clear now that human strength should not be underestimated. The elder wondered where Fujimura had found such power. Fujimura said with a grin that it wasn't magic. What they had just seen wasn't a spell or a supernatural event. It was pure crafting technique. The elder thanked Fujimura for the favor, saying even this gesture was part of the White Wolf's code. Fujimura's group felt a brief wave of relief and joy, however. The elder's tone changed when he asked them to leave immediately. Their arrival, he said, had come at a deeply troubling time. White Wolf Village stood divided, with traditionalists determined to preserve their customs and way of life and radicals who wanted to use their power to impose their will on the world, leaving the people caught between two clashing ideologies. The elder and the traditionalists accepted outsiders like Fujimura's group, but refused to forgive the radicals. A child in their care called Pipsqueak had parents who sided with the radicals, which brought suspicion. Then a messenger interrupted. They reported that warrior Siyu had been captured, and, after being stabbed by the enemy, he raised a weapon. It was unmistakably one of their access points. Its deliberate abandonment was a cruel message. Pipsqueak looked shaken. Fujimura quickly assessed the scene and noted how unstable Pip's family was. He asked the elder to lead them to the enemy camp so they could speak to the enemy directly. The traditionalists did not share his intent and called the idea outrageous. The elder warned that any attempt to parley would likely lead to Fujimura's death. There was another village, the elder continued, farther out and home to a human clan renowned for slaying dragons. Within that village lived a Salyuan, a powerful being known as the Flame Princess. Freya was surprised by the name. The elder confirmed it. Once hailed a hero for saving the village from a black dragon, she had now used her power to rally the youth into rebellion and become the de facto leader of the radicalists. Looking back, the elder feared her earlier act of heroism might have been part of a larger manipulation. Fujimura smirked when he heard the name, the Flame Princess. The name only strengthened his resolve, and he revealed they also had business with her. The elder, confused, asked whether Fujimura already knew the woman. Fujimura admitted he didn't know and said they'd have to find out when they met her. Still, he declared that nothing, not even the white wolves, would stop them, and the elder relented, accepting his resolve. The elder offered them a guide, Shaga, the village's strongest warrior, and said he would accompany them. Shaga voiced his discontent, asking why he had to escort the humans. The elder invoked the code again, leaving him no choice and silencing any protest, so bound to obey he complied while Bridge, eager and full of ambition, insisted on joining as well. Dreaming of making it big, he sensed Fujimura's group offered a real chance. Traveling with him seemed like the break he'd been waiting for. Freyup considered Bridge's ambition, while Fujimura let him act as he wished, though Fujimura's remarks made it clear he didn't take Bridges seriously, leaving Bridges surprised by the bluntness as El Tico watched, grinned at him for his foolishness, and warned him not to get ahead of himself. Bridge felt the situation getting more exciting, with dragons and Saluants, and everything pointed to their adventure becoming something much bigger. At last, the group reached the outskirts of another village. Hidden under the tree canopy, they watched the settlement. Shaga said it was the radicalists' stronghold, and having masked their scent to avoid detection, he warned everyone to stay alert. Fujimura asked Freya if she was ready, since they might be close to reuniting with her mother. Though she said she was ready, Freya still felt doubt, and the person ahead did not seem like her mother. The woman Freya remembered hated conflict and would never have caused a split in the village. Freya suspected someone was using her mother's name and reputation, taking the title Flame Princess for their own ends. If that was true, the person must know something about her birth mother, and Fujimura understood her point of view. Grinning, he signaled they would confront the Flame Princess and expose her true intentions. Before anyone could say more, an axe flew toward them. Fujimura reacted immediately. He uses his wrench to intercept. Stop at Meteor, the ambush began. A figure stepped from a tree's shadow. A radical had found them. Snarling, she revealed herself. Shagawa recognized the attacker and addressed her as Jija. In a flash, Jija lunged at them. Fujimura met her attack. A wrench struck an axe. Their weapons collided with force. She stepped back. He pulled out another axe and hurled it with deadly precision. It narrowly missed Shaga. Jija launched another attack and clashed with Shaga, who countered her. The two warriors broke apart again as Jiggy sprang back into the trees, catching her breath and showing clear strength and speed. Fujimura himself stayed cautious, a clear sign this opponent was no ordinary fighter. More footsteps followed. A large number of enemies had arrived. Shagestead stood firm beside Fujimura's group as the radicalists approached. One of them called to Shaga and asked why he was there. She locked eyes on Pip, her expression turning to disdain. She called Pip the White Wolf's shame, her gaze sharp and condemning, and now she understood. Even Shaga had brought that so-called coward along. Tears filled Pip's eyes. Fujimura's anger flared as he lashed out at the radicalist who had insulted Pip, furious at her arrogance, and demanded to know who had given her the right to judge and insult others. He refused to let any of it go. Shaga, however, said the radical had that right, which only increased the tension. Pip cried out. She called for her mother. The word stunned Fujimura, and he thought in disbelief, Mama. Pip's face lit with hope, the look of a child who believed she had found her parent, but the woman said nothing and Fujimura grew more agitated. He refused to accept that Pip was calling that woman her mother. Tears in her eyes, Pip called to her mother. Fujimura and Freya fell silent. Pip's mother paused and answered coldly that it was too late. Frightened, Pip had run away, leaving her home behind. For her, the White Wolf clan had no place for the weak. Disowning Pip, she revealed her true name, Lanalua, and ordered her never to appear before her again. The act cut their parent-child bond, and Pip collapsed in tears. Fujimura slammed his weapon into a tree, sending a loud blast that stunned everyone nearby. The outburst stunned both radicals and traditionalists. Fujimura looked furious. Fujimura couldn't stomach the harsh rejection Pip had just faced. He thought about all Pip had endured, the struggles she faced alone and carried on her small, fragile body. He argued that showing a little compassion would not cause harm and directly challenged the mother's cruelty. Pip's mother replied with disdain, saying Fujimura could do nothing if she refused to show kindness and dismissing him as nothing more than a lonely human. As tension rose, Freya tried to calm things and urged everyone to avoid reckless decisions and to talk it through first, not just for Pip but for the village's future. Pip's mother dismissed the suggestion, and the radicalist rallied behind her. They saw discussion as pointless. Those losses were not forgotten. A comrade had been slain by what they said were the traditionalists' deceitful tactics. Her words were full of resentment and hostility. Confused, Fujimura turned to Shaga and asked how the two factions really differed. Shaga replied in a detached, logical voice that the radicals were most likely killed by the forest beasts, saying their only real strengths had been lies and cowardice. Pip's mother decided they were irreconcilable, like oil and water, and could never mix, so the issue would be settled at the upcoming full moon leadership contest, as tradition required. That was where any decision about the village's future would be made. Fujimura was surprised by the revelation. Shaga welcomed the idea, seeing the contest as the best way to decide which side truly represented the White Wolf's spirit. Turning to Fujimura, he said it was time to return. The confrontation was over for now. Night fell as the group made camp deep in the forest, and Fujimura, still angry, let his frustration out. He hadn't heard anything about any leadership contest beforehand, and to make matters worse, they had completely forgotten to ask about the Flame Princess. Shagya reassured him that, as a representative, the Flame Princess would attend the contest. He explained that the rules required 4 representatives to fight for dominance, and the losers had to swear total obedience to the winner on their honor as White Wolves. Shaga said this was exactly why the elder wanted them to leave. Even if they won, the radicals might refuse to accept the result. A bloodbath seemed likely. Shaga stood and repeated his warning. They should not get involved. This was an internal struggle only the White Wolves could resolve. Bridget agreed with Shaga, who insisted he needed to stay healthy for his future plans and urged the others to leave with him. Fujimura refused. Already committed, he could not pull back now, especially with the mystery around Pip and her mother still unresolved. He turned to Bridge and offered him the choice to leave if he truly wanted to. Overwhelmed, Bridge called out to his master. Then the full moon contest began as radicalists and traditionalists gathered for the decisive event. Shagawa was there, Jija was too, and Fujimura and his party stood among them. The moment had come. Everyone gathered for the battle that would decide the White Wolf clan's future. The traditionalists murmured among themselves when they saw the opposing side. It was the radical faction. Fujimura studied the seated figures across from them. It became clear that one of them was the Flame Princess. Freya froze in place. The elder stood holding his axe. The contest was declared open, a 4-on-4 representative battle to decide the successor to the White Wolf clan's royal seat. Their ancient code of honor bound everyone to accept the outcome, and the royal command was absolute. Not even the factions' combined will could overturn it. Bridge felt the full weight of the situation, knowing this fight would decide the next ruler. The elder formally introduced the 4 representatives of the traditionalist faction. Shaga will shoot Kakaki and himself. Fujimura was caught off guard by the elder's inclusion and mocked to himself that the old man's joining the fight already meant another loss, so Freya quickly stopped him from speaking. On the radicalist side, their representatives were announced as Jija, Vigil, and Amaru. And the Flame Princess. Jeja, Pip's mother, gave her daughter a cold glance. Her eyes were sharp and unreadable. Amaru told Jeja he was worried. He reminded her of how long she had been searching for her daughter. They imagined the worst, how things could turn bloody, and feared what would happen if Linnea got caught up in it. but Jija stayed indifferent because she had already warned her daughter to stay away. It was too late. Her daughter no longer looked to her for help after she had driven her away, and she knew she had caused Lanalu to leave the village. Hatred was unavoidable. Amaru accepted it. All that remained was to do their duty as warriors. Together, they would fight under the Flame Princess's banner, determined that no one would ever erase the pain the Black Dragon caused. Steady in her resolve, Jeja agreed. The elder opened the match by naming Vigil as the first warrior to fight for the radicalists. The radical crowd broke into cheers. The elder turned to announce the traditionalist fighter, but froze in disbelief when he saw all 4 traditionalist representatives already unconscious on the ground, knocked out before the battle even began. The radicalists were equally stunned. Then Fujimura stepped forward and introduced himself. Even his own companions were stunned by what he had done, and Vigil, furious and confused by Fujimura's interference, demanded an explanation and began insulting him. Before he could finish, Fujimura hit him hard on the head with his wrench, and Vigil collapsed instantly. The radicalist faction erupted in outrage and disbelief at Fujimura's move, but he made clear he would not let this pointless battle drag on. The rules were changing. From now on it would be everyone against him, and whoever survived would be the winner. They were warned to stay sharp, because if they were careless, he might become their king.